Hello everyone. If you are new to my channel, then consider liking and subscribing. It will make me feel wonderful if you do it, thanks. By the way, I also have a Luffy fan fiction channel. If you are interested, the link is in the description. Doomed to Repeat by Fiachra Ochiern. 1 year after Jiraiya's death, Naruto is no longer the ninja he once was. Faced with the chance to change everything that went wrong, can Naruto rise above the strength of his enemies, the suspicions of his friends, and most of all, his own weaknesses? I don't own anything. Now let's get started.
Chapter 18. Sakura glanced over the scroll in her hands as she made her way down the street. Iruka-sensei had been glad to give his former student a thin scroll on basic medical techniques. The first thing Sakura learned was that Iryo Jutsu would be slow-going. The scroll didn't even cover ways to incorporate what little Sakura knew about first aid, blood-stopping pills and the like, with chakra requirements and hand seals. Instead, the first really practical exercise was how to keep a fish alive out of water by enveloping its gills in chakra. Very slow-going, indeed. "Hey, Sakura!" Sakura stopped suddenly and scanned the streets for the one who had called her name. Unsurprisingly, her best friend. Or was it rivals now? Wasn't hard to spot as she hurried to catch up with Sakura, her apron from her family's floral shop still draped over her regular clothes. "Are you too busy to say hi, Forehead-chan?" Ino demanded. Sakura glowered at the girl her own age. "Hi, Ino pig," she responded. "I've been calling you." Ino planted her hands on her hips firmly. "What are you reading?" Out of habit, Sakura clutched the scroll closer to her chest, determined not to let her rival get the upper hand on her. But then, it couldn't hurt to let Ino know, could it? Especially since Sakura was sure that Ino wouldn't take this as an encroachment on her. "It's a scroll on Iryo Jutsu," she explained, leaving out the part about getting it from Iruka-sensei. If Ino wanted to know where Sakura had gotten new information for her future career as an amazing kunoichi, she would have to find out herself. "Medical techniques?" Ino peered at the scroll over Sakura's shoulder. "With chakra?" "It's something I'm studying before our next mission," Sakura replied confidently, even though she was sure her next mission would be something like walking Kakashi's Ninken or something equally trivial. Kakashi-sensei had said that they still needed time to recover. Like first aid and nursing? Ino's eyes took on an interested glow that Sakura wasn't sure she liked. "Sasuke-kun and Keiru-kun got hurt on our last mission," Sakura explained. "I wanted to find something that would help them." Ino pinned Sakura with a serious gaze. "Is Sasuke-kun still injured?" "No," Sakura shook her head in denial. "They're both all right now. Keiru-kun knew some first aid, and he said he heals fast." Sakura thought she had proof of that last statement. Naruto had bounced back the fastest after their mission, while Sasuke's scrape was just fading to the point where the scab had turned into old skin. Keiru himself had been hardest to judge, as he always kept his wounds covered and changed the bandages himself, sometimes with Naruto's help. But Naruto wouldn't say how his cousin was doing, either. Just a firm declaration that Keiru-ni-san was strong. Although, Sakura was beginning to see that, too. "Who's Keiru-kun?" Ino demanded. "He's Naruto's older cousin," replied Sakura, unthinking. "He just started living in Konoha recently, and he came with us on our mission." At Ino's puzzled frown, Sakura felt the need to explain further. "He looks kind of like Naruto," she explained, "but he has red hair. He's 17. "Does he have blue eyes?" Ino pursed her lips together thoughtfully. "Yes. I think I've seen him," announced the blonde suddenly. "He came into the shop one day to buy flowers for a memorial." Sakura ran her teeth along her bottom lip briefly. Keiru had never quite explained his own history, and Sakura didn't know how he had come to Konoha. But she knew that he had no family besides Naruto. Keiru himself had said that there were no other Uzumaki anywhere. And Naruto had always been an orphan. Sakura flinched at the thought. The reprimand she had gotten from Sasuke still pricked her conscience. She didn't know what it was like to be alone. The closest she had ever come was when she had been crying by herself because the other girls thought her forehead was hideous. "Is he really an okay guy?" Ino asked. "Choji thought he acted kind of strange in the shop." Sakura's eyes snapped over to her once friend. "Keiru-kun's a good guy," she defended the older boy. "And he keeps Naruto from being too annoying. So, you and Sasuke-kun can have more time alone." Ino's eyes narrowed sharply. "You crafty kunoichi. I bet you're just learning medical jutsu so that you can be the one to nurse Sasuke-kun back to health when he gets injured." "No, that's not it," Sakura immediately began to protest. "You won't win that way, Forehead-chan," declared Yamanaka Ino. "I'll be an even better Iryo nin than you. And Sasuke won't want anyone to treat his wounds but me." "You couldn't heal a fish," retorted Sakura automatically. She clutched the scroll to her chest to prevent Ino from spying out any techniques, even if they were only for healing fish lungs. "Watch me." Ino stuck her tongue out at her old classmate, then spun on her heel and marched back to the Yamanaka floral shop without waiting for a response. Sakura scowled at Ino's back, then hurried down the street once more. She was supposed to be at the Hokage Tower for her next mission with Team 7, and once again Kaoru-kun would be accompanying them. Slowing down, Sakura glanced over her shoulder to where Ino had disappeared. Ino did have it wrong. Sakura hadn't really been thinking of Sasuke-kun when she asked Iruka-sensei for any information he had on Iryo techniques. Oh, she had thought of him, but it hadn't been a picture of coming to Sasuke's rescue or falling in love with each other over a sick bed. Instead, Sakura couldn't get the image of Sasuke's cold face, decorated with long senbon, out of her head. She wanted to be able to help. Sakura tucked the scroll into the small pouch that held her weapons. She could read over the scroll after her mission. Right now, she was determined not to be later than Kakashi-sensei. Naruto would never let her live that down. Kaoru rocked back and forth on his heels as he stood in the hall outside the Hokage office, waiting for admittance. Boring, Naruto sing-songed from his place next to Kaoru. We have to wait for Kakashi-sensei, reprimanded Sakura, although her twisting lips betrayed her own displeasure. Sasuke's glower at the closed door echoed her unspoken sentiments. Maybe we should just go ahead without him, Naruto suggested. Kaoru-ni-san can be in charge. Kaoru chuckled. Finally, he grinned widely. I've been promoted to sensei. Ma, came a lazy voice. No need to replace me just because I'm running a little late. Kaoru turned his grin on his old teacher, ready to shoot back that it was Kakashi's fault that his own students were betraying him for a teenage sensei. But Sakura beat him to it. A little, she repeated in disbelief. You said we were supposed to be here an hour ago. Ah, see, I got lost on the way here, Kakashi explained. So I had to turn around and retrace my steps. He's lying, isn't he? Naruto whispered loudly to Sakura. She just rolled her eyes and huffed at their reluctant sensei rather than smacking her teammate over the head. Kaoru smiled at their antics. It was a good sign. His team was getting stronger already, and they didn't even recognize the way their bonds tied them together. Not yet. Well, shall we go? Kakashi smiled innocently and waved his team towards the door. Kaoru knocked Naruto's back as he entered the office behind Kakashi, forcing the boy to move forward or be run into. Sandaime was waiting patiently for the team behind his desk with his usual pipe clamped firmly in his mouth. Kaoru couldn't help one side of his mouth turning up at the sight of the old man, as it always did. Even if he couldn't actually tell any of his adopted family how much he missed them, he would never give up the opportunity at least to see them. Fluke or not. Team 7, Sarutobi greeted the Genin team. Good job again on your last mission. Naruto beamed at the praise. Yeah, we kicked ass, he agreed jubilantly. What you got for us next, Ojiji? His enthusiasm was rewarded with a fist to Hashira. Kaoru had about given up on erasing that particular habit. As long as Naruto still said whatever popped into his head, Sakura's temperament would demand reprisal. Team 7 will have a courier mission, announced the Hokage. This will be your first joint mission, I believe. Joint mission? Questioned Sasuke. You mean besides me? Kaoru jerked his thumb at his own chest. Joint missions weren't unheard of for Genin. He had gone on plenty of missions with the shinobi he had graduated with, or with their sensei if Kakashi was called away for a mission that required the copy nin's talents. Team 11 is short one member due to an injury, explained Sarutobi. You will be joined by their remaining 2 members for this mission, as their sensei has expressed a wish for them to journey outside of Konoha. Which one's Team 11? Naruto whispered from the corner of his mouth, leaning toward his cousin. Kaoru just shrugged and shook his head. He only remembered 3 teams of Naruto's class actually passing, although that was a pretty average number for each graduating class from the academy. Eventually, teams were identified by their sensei or, sometimes, by their characteristics. People still referred to Sarutobi's old team as the Densetsu no Sanin. You will be delivering this scroll to the listed contact Hikui. Sarutobi lifted a short scroll in one hand. Your teammates for this mission have already been told to join you at the gates of Konoha in 1 hour. Hi, Kakashi responded formally as he stepped forward to take the scroll. Cool, Naruto declared. Let's go. He led the charge back out of the office, probably planning on stuffing as much as he could into his pack and taking off as soon as possible. Sasuke shook his head as he tagged along, and Sakura followed after both boys. Kaoru turned to exit with his kind of team but glanced over his shoulder when he didn't notice Kakashi following. The Junin stood in front of his Hokage and received a second scroll. Kaoru looked back to the door before he got caught staring and walked out calmly. Kakashi may have just been accepting the details of the mission, like the name of their contact. Kakashi soon followed Kaoru out the door, closing it behind him, and Kaoru faced his old teacher as if nothing were amiss. How far is it to Hikui? He asked. It should just take half a day, walking, answered Kakashi. We won't be gone more than 2 days. I'll tell Naruto not to pack too much ramen. Kaoru nodded firmly, that he decided, and trudged down the stairs. Don't be late, Kakashi called. Yeah. Kaoru just raised one hand in a lazy wave, channeling Shikamaru, and kept going. What was the point of acknowledging a command Kakashi was unlikely to follow himself? Naruto pouted at the sight of 10 different ramen cups stacked on his table. Kakashi-sensei said we'll only be gone for 2 days, commanded Karu-ni-san. You can't take that much. Naruto glared at the older boy, who was in the process of wrapping his ink palette in a worn, white cloth and tucking it into his own bag. Karu had instructed him to pack light, but cutting down on the ramen was taking it a bit far. What if something happens, and he gets stuck on the way? Naruto argued. They'd need the ramen for emergency food, if that were the case. Then I'll know that some kami has it in for me if I can't even get through a simple courier mission, muttered Karu. Karu slid his ink and supplies into his bag and paused to study his tools. I'm gonna need a new brush soon, he remarked to himself. Naruto bit his lip thoughtfully and studied his cousin. Karu had gotten robbed on the way to Konoha, so he didn't have much stuff. He still slept on the couch Naruto kept in the first room of the apartment that he had been in since he was 6. He kept wearing the same clothes, too, or switching between shirts when one got too dirty. Just like Naruto did with his own laundry. It cost money to wash his clothes one floor down, and he didn't really like having to sit there and wait until the machine was done. Too many people came and then left as soon as they saw him, like he made the room unlivable just by being in it. Huh. Karu's sudden exhalation, like he had found something interesting, made Naruto's head jerk up to see Karu holding a thin scroll in one hand while he kept his pack open with the other. I forgot I had this, Karu noted. Naruto craned his neck wonderingly at the scroll in Karu's hand. What is it? Karu looked up at Naruto and put on his thinking face. Something I was working on before, he answered, then tucked the scroll into his pack. Maybe if we have time. Naruto frowned when Karu didn't finish his sentence. He hated being kept out of the loop. What? Naruto demanded. Karu's head jerked up as he smiled at his cousin. Maybe I can go over it on the way to Hakui. Can you teach me? Naruto's eyes widened at the thought of this newly discovered possible technique that his cousin knew. No, Karu replied immediately. This is something I'm still working on. Naruto eyes Karu but then went back to his bag and his ramen. He supposed it was okay that Karu-ni-san wanted to wait to show his secret project until it was completely ready. But Naruto was still curious. Will we get to do training on this mission? He questioned. Maybe. Karu shrugged carelessly. Depends how fast we can get to the city. So we can train once we get there? Naruto confirmed. Sure. Naruto grinned widely. Training with Karu-ni-san would definitely make up for the boringness of the mission, especially compared with the last one. Although, he supposed that he could live without the people trying to kill him and his friends part. Karu flipped his pack closed and flipped it over one shoulder. Come on, he motioned to Naruto. We might as well wait for Kakashi-sensei someplace we know he'll show up. Naruto nodded obediently as Karu turned away. Naruto grabbed one of the packages of ramen on the table and squished it into his bag while Karu's back was still turned. By the time the redhead led the way to the door, Naruto was fully prepared with enough ramen to last him at least 2 days. Maybe 3 if he didn't eat all 5 servings for one meal. Maybe he could buy his big brother a new brush with the money they got from this mission. Yash, before our comrades arrive, I shall complete 300 push-ups with my right hand alone. Hyuga Neji had learned long ago not to pay any attention to his teammate when he got in one of these kinds of moods. It was bad enough dealing with Guy-sensei regularly when he wasn't training within the Hyuga complex. Guy, Neji knew, had the power and the strength to back up his claims. Neji had only seen the man in serious combat a handful of times, if that. But it was enough to know that the man, for all his eccentricities, was well feared by his enemies. Lee, however, was just crazy. Neji returned to staring at the wide, hard-packed dirt road that led away from Konoha. It branched off in 3 different directions 1 kilometer from the village. And it was the road they were expected to take, as soon as their temporary teammates showed up. Neji did not keep track of new genin, nor did he much care to. There were few who were born for greatness, anyway. So if we can use the trees to get there faster, why don't we just do that? Neji looked in the direction of the demand, loud, harsh, and ruder than Neji generally preferred his companions to be. If he ever actively pursued companions. A group of 4 shinobi, one notably older and taller than the others, approached the gate with packs on their backs and enough purpose to their step to convince Neji that these were to be his teammates for the duration of the mission to Hakui. That wastes chakra, Dobi, retorted the darkest boy. Neji suspected he knew the boy, most likely from academy, but he couldn't remember a name. Actually most Chunin and Junin travel that way, when they can. The oldest one, a redhead, adjusted the pack slungter. By the time you get promoted, you'll have the chakra reserves necessary for it. The 4-man team was close enough now to notice Neji and Lee, halfway through his 68th push-up. The lone kunoichi, a girl with absurdly pink hair, directed her eyes to Neji first. Hello, she greeted politely. Are you our teammates for the mission to Hakui? Neji was prevented from answering by Lee's stupendous leap from the ground to land, somehow, miraculously, directly in front of the girl. "I am Rock Lee," he announced grandly. "Will you go out with me?" The girl's reaction was amusing. She edged away from Lee, giving the dark boy beside her a furtive glance like she expected him to do something. Sakura-chan. It was the blonde boy, the one who had asked about tree traveling, who approached his teammate first. "Your name is Sakura?" Lee confirmed, then immediately launched into his nice guy pose with a bright grin that briefly outshined the morning sun. "I will protect you with my life on this mission." No, replied Sakura hurriedly. "That's all right, really." Neji had to admit that the kunoichi was handling Lee well. Tenten would have slapped him upside the head by now. Or just pinned one of his sandals to the ground with a well-aimed kunai. Before Lee could issue a self-challenge to prove his worth, Neji felt a whirlwind of chakra that announced his sensei every morning. "My youthful students," Maida Guy shouted in a voice that would not be denied being heard. "I have come to see you off on your next mission." "Guy-sensei!" Lee cried in delight. Neji rolled his eyes dramatically before he heard a strangled noise coming from one of the new arrivals. He looked at the redhead, unsurprised that the older boy was staring at Lee and Guy with wide eyes. His throat was convulsing as if he were trying to swallow, or to hold something back. Suddenly, the redhead's gaze shifted, and Neji found himself caught in a gaze that was far too piercing to be amused. "And these shall be your teammates while the beautiful Tenten recovers." Guy quickly turned to 3 shocked genin and 1 redhead who directed his attention back to Konoha's taijutsu master. "But where is your sensei?" "Ah, Kakashi-sensei's always late." The blonde genin waved one hand through the air as if it didn't matter. "Can it be? The students of my esteemed rival? Such hip attitudes could only be the product of Kakashi-san?" Neji suddenly found the new team much more interesting. Guy-sensei often mentioned his rival, Hitaki Kakashi, and the state of their constant battles. At last count, Kakashi was winning by 1 victory. Neji only knew that Kakashi was reputed to be the opposite of Guy-sensei. "You know Kakashi-sensei?" the blonde demanded. "Hey, does he talk about me?" "We don't even know your name." Neji felt inclined to remind the boy. "Why would he speak of you?" The blonde suddenly shot Neji a hot glare usually reserved for people who kick pets. "Uzumaki Naruto, future Hokage of Konohagakure," he proclaimed as he shoved his thumb into his own orange-clad chest. "Datbayo." Neji refused to believe in such a statement. This kid should never have passed his graduation exam, let alone his genin test. "Ah, such youthful exuberance," Guy went off again. "Surely your springtime of youth explodes within you, Uzumaki-kun." Naruto furrowed his eyebrows together at the man's declaration, then glanced down at his stomach as if he expected his springtime to explode out of him at any moment. "Ah, give him a break." The redhead shook his head toward Guy suddenly. "There's something to be said for autumn, too." Guy looked thoroughly appalled. "Why do you speak so, student of my esteemed rival?" He made a fist and held it like a trophy before him. "The springtime of youth is the most beloved season of life, filled with the passion my student so aptly contains." "Thank you, Guy-sensei." Neji was pretty sure those were, indeed, tears running down Lee's cheeks. "Yeah, but if you make it to autumn, at least you don't get cut down halfway through youth," the redhead shrugged. Guy simply stared at the young man, silent. Neji wondered if he had actually witnessed his sensei being made speechless. He had become too used to tuning Guy out to consider the implications if one carried his sensei's favorite analogy to completion. "Oi, ni-san." Naruto leaned toward the older boy and muttered from the corner of his mouth. "What are you talking about?" The older Uzumaki ducked his head and broke into a sheepish grin as he raised one hand to rub at the back of his head. "Nothing," he declared quickly. "It's nothing." He looked up at Guy again, and his grin turned into a reassurance. "We'll take care of your students, sensei." Uzumaki nodded once to convey the seriousness of his promise. Guy-sensei quickly found his tongue again. Such a prime example of responsibility and maturity. He cried to the heavens. "Surely your flames of youth burn brightly within you." "Guy-sensei." Lee was quick to join him. "It will be a joy to work with such esteemed comrades as this." Neji glanced over his temporary teammates and doubted he could honestly affirm the sentiment. Uzumaki's quick glance back into the village proper made Neji turn his head to see a man in a Junin vest walking nonchalantly towards the gate. "Ah, Kakashi," Guy quickly identified the man. "My esteemed rival." "Yo," was all Hitaki Kakashi said. "Can we leave?" demanded the dark genin whom Neji had yet to place. "Everyone seems to be here." Kakashi's right eye traveled lazily across the genin gathered just outside Konoha's large gates. He received a punk kind of salute from the red-haired Uzumaki for his troubles. 2 fingers held straight while the rest were curled into his fist. "Lee, do well on your mission," Guy commanded finally. "Yosh." Lee raised one fist as determination overtook his eyes like fire. "I will complete this mission to the best of my abilities, or I shall run 1,000 laps around Konoha's walls." When Sakura opened her mouth with a decided frown, Neji almost thought the kunoichi was going to comment on the absurdity of his statement. But her teammates crowded in front of her in their eagerness to get on the road. The older Uzumaki set forth with a smile that was almost amused, but contained something else as well. Neji walked alongside the older ninja while Kakashi followed at the rear. "Would I wanna bet he's the first one into Hakui?" Uzumaki nodded at Lee, who was leading the way by a wide margin. The three genin in front of him glanced back to the questioner. Neji clearly saw the frown dance across the dark-haired genin's face. "He's crazy," the boy scoffed and turned back to the road. "Newsflash, Uchiha," Uzumaki shot back, "he could beat you in your swirly eyes." So, the boy had now been identified. This was the Uchiha heir. Sasuke, Neji thought his name was. He was so concentrated on the boy's name that it took his mind a moment to register the rest of Uzumaki's declaration. "Lee could beat the Sharingan? You don't know your own weaknesses," said Uzumaki softly, so softly that Neji doubted Uchiha Sasuke had heard the critique. Maybe it was just as well. Uzumaki didn't exactly sound like he wanted to be heard. Kakashi was still in the back of the party when the sun was at its peak. Keiru and Naruto had taken up the lead, although at the moment Lee was pressing Naruto to a foot race, so Keiru was left alone. Beside Keiru, Sakura held a scroll in front of her, studying it with such an intensity that a part of Kakashi wondered how she could keep from tripping. Sasuke and Neji followed them, neither really saying much. Keiru suddenly craned his neck to scan the road in front of him, then glance over his shoulder at the rest of his team. "Is something wrong, Keiru-kun?" Kakashi asked with a bright smile while he keenly scanned their surroundings. If Keiru felt something, it could mean trouble. Shouldn't Neji be? Keiru began, then trailed off with a frown when he actually looked at the young Hyuga. Nah, never mind. Kakashi raised one eye. He was beginning to expect unexpected outbursts from Keiru. The boy was about as unpredictable as his adopted younger brother, only for different reasons. Keiru did things, new things, that Kakashi didn't think he should have been able to. Fortunately, Sandame seemed to realize Keiru's strange idiosyncrasies as well and was finally ready to do something about it. Kakashi briefly wondered what Keiru would do if he knew that this mission had been conjured because of him. "Ma, you'll make us curious." Kakashi noted the way Neji perked up at the mention of his name and wondered if it had been entirely prudent of Sandame to assign two boys to this mission as well. Keiru glanced over his shoulder once again and then tilted his head dramatically to one side so that he seemed to be speaking to the forest astride of the road instead of the Junin behind him. "I thought it would be better if Neji took the lead," Keiru confessed. With his eyes, he could see what's coming. "Interesting," commented Kakashi, "but we're not expecting anything unusual." "I know." Keiru quickly waved one hand through the air, as if to bat away unwanted words. "That's why I said, never mind." Kakashi nodded thoughtfully, seemingly done with the conversation, but he was still curious. He hadn't shared his own theories with Sandame about Keiru, nor had Sandame postulated anything in Kakashi's presence. He only commanded the Junin sensei to keep an eye on Keiru during the mission and report back any unusual behavior. "And if we were?" Kakashi asked. Unusual behavior would be much easier to spot if Keiru actually did something other than walk down the road with his hands in his pockets. Keiru shot Kakashi a puzzled look over his shoulder, and Kakashi took the opportunity provided. "If this team was assembled for a different mission," he suggested, "say, to intercept an enemy, what formation would you use?" Keiru stopped dead in his tracks and spun around to face Kakashi, but there was no suspicion in the young man's eyes, only surprise. "You're asking me?" He gaped for a moment. "Why not?" Keiru looked around him at the team he was with. Then, with his hands still in his pockets, Keiru started to walk backwards, facing Kakashi as he affected a thoughtful look. "Well, there's 6 of us," he started slowly. "So, me and Neji'd take the front, 'cause of Neji's eyes. Naruto and Lee behind us for heavy hitting once we catch up to them. Sakura and Sasuke in the middle. And you'd be our rear." "Indeed." Kakashi nodded. "You put a Junin at the rear of a search party?" "I'd rather have you at my back than anyone, Kakashi." Keiru's smile was briefly out of place under a mess of red hair. It should have been golden. Then Keiru spun on his heel in mid-stride and all traces of Kakashi's sensei disappeared into a teenager who still knew too much. "Besides, I'm not really sure how Naruto and Lee would take a real mission without annoying the heck out of everyone else." "Why don't you find out?" Keiru stared back at Kakashi in shock once again. "Huh?" he questioned eloquently. "Take the lead with Neji," Kakashi commanded. "Have the others take the formation you suggested." Really, Keiru, for some reason, was still dubious. "It'll keep them from getting bored." Kakashi shrugged as if that were the only reason he was giving free rein to Keiru. "Like Naruto needs anything other than Lee to keep him busy," muttered Keiru. But he called both Naruto and Lee back to join the rest of the group anyway. Kakashi watched silently as Keiru explained the drill to Naruto and Lee, speaking loud enough so that both Neji and Sasuke behind him could hear their assignments. Kakashi didn't know which was more surprising, the fact that Sasuke didn't complain at being paired with Sakura or the fact that Sakura didn't break into a blush at being paired with Sasuke. She only looked regretfully at the scroll she carried as she rolled it up and placed it back in her weapon's holster. Naruto's enthusiasm for racing Lee was quickly tempered into obeying his cousin, and Neji took his position in the front. His team in formation. Keiru looked up from the shorter kids he had been ordering around and waved cheerfully at Kakashi at the rear. Kakashi raised one hand to wave back and then shoved his hand back in his pocket when Keiru turned his back. He had to stop seeing only Keiru's eyes or smile. It was coloring his view of the kid, and he couldn't afford to miss something just because he wanted to see a man who had been dead for 12 years. Keiru could probably say, in all honesty, that Uchiha Itachi could have appeared in the middle of the road in front of him with his fish-faced partner and Keiru would have been less surprised than he currently was. The last thing he expected on this mission was to be put in charge. Kakashi-sensei was up to something. Not that the copy nin wasn't usually up to something. Keiru just knew it had to do with him this time, and yet, all Kakashi was currently doing was smiling at the backs of his team and pretending that he was guarding a team on its way to intercept an enemy. Keiru had immediately thought of the team of genin, mostly rookies who had failed their first chunin exams, that had been sent to retrieve a wayward Uchiha who had decided that he could do better with a nuke nin than with his own home. Keiru didn't have a Kumaru or the Inuzuka nose, so he had put himself and the Hyuga eyes at the forefront of the drive. Of course, with Neji glaring at the road in front of him without his Dujutsu activated, Keiru was beginning to grow impatient for the exercise to be over. Naruto wasn't helping with his wavering attention. "Do you really think this is gonna help us?" Naruto demanded. "We're not even looking for anything, like on our last mission. No one's gonna attack us." "Quit it, Gaki," grumbled Keiru. He should have thought out the positions better. If he was walking with Naruto instead of Neji, at least they could get in some training or even information that the boy would need in the future. Keiru glanced over his shoulder to see Naruto's pout, but his slumped shoulders and hands in his pockets betrayed the boy's disappointment more than resentment. "If you figure out how to channel your chakra to the palm of your right hand, I'll teach you a jutsu," Keiru called, facing front once again. "Really?" Naruto straightened immediately. "Cool." Keiru smiled. It couldn't be Rasengan that he taught Naruto. He'd have a hell of a time explaining that to Sandaime, much less Kakashi. But maybe the kid could learn something simpler, like Repusho or maybe even Kazekiri, if he could concentrate long enough. Keiru knew he had the potential, even if Keiru turned out to be a bad teacher. Although, considering the examples he grew up with, Keiru didn't think he could screw it up too bad. Beside him, Neji huffed at the brotherly exchange. Keiru tilted his head thoughtfully before deciding he might as well give himself his own distraction. "Your eyes getting tired, Neji?" he questioned, even though he knew what the answer would be. Neji turned his head just enough to fix Keiru with a perturbed stare, like he was offended that Keiru could even suggest such a thing. Silently, Neji looked back to the road in front of him. "No," the Hyuga finally answered. Keiru rolled his eyes. "You're about as social as Uchiha back there, y'all know that?" He jerked his head to indicate his once and future teammate. "Please do not compare us, it wasn't a request. You do got some things in common, Neji." In spite of himself, Keiru grinned. "Face it." Keiru had forgotten that all supposed geniuses in Konoha came with the same superiority complex. Knowing what he did about Neji, his skills and his protective nature toward Hinata, Keiru found this version of Neji almost laughable. He wondered if Neji was like this with his own teammates as well. Lee had revealed, only because Lee talked as much as he did, that the beautiful and competent Tenten was back in Konoha with a fractured radius, but she was expected to heal fully in a few days here to the Sharingan in Konoha. Neji stated blandly. "I was designated to a lower position at my birth. Fate determined that he would have wings to soar." Keiru frowned. He had also forgotten about the cage Neji felt he was in. "I don't buy into that crap," Keiru shot back hotly. He never had believed in fate, even when Neji had first started spouting it in the Chunin exams. Neji looked over to Keiru, dubious at first before his gaze turned completely disapproving. "Those who try to fight fate are doomed to have their wings clipped," he declared authoritatively. Keiru opened his mouth, ready to reproach the kid even if he didn't know quite what he was going to say. At any rate, what did a 13-year-old know about fate that a 17-year-old time-traveling kid turned into his own brother? Actually, Keiru was pretty sure that had absolutely nothing to do with fate. But then, Neji's eyes sharpened in a way that made the veins in his temples bulge with extra blood and chakra. "What is it?" demanded Keiru, because he didn't think Neji would activate his Dujutsu just to avoid a conversation. "3 shinobi are approaching from the northeast," Neji reported succinctly. "Perfect," muttered Keiru. He spun around to face the rest of his team. "Oi, we're gonna have some visitors." Naruto abruptly stopped staring at the palm of his hand and looked up, while Sasuke dropped into a defensive position with his knees bent. Kakashi removed his hands from his pockets and let his arms linger by his sides. Sakura looked wary but prepared, and Keiru was pretty sure that Lee's trembling was only because of excitement. Keiru turned back to the road just in time to face a tall, dark man who burst out of the forest and landed straight on the middle of the road. He looked ready to continue running when he caught sight of the team of genin that were prepared for him. His dark eyes widened suddenly, and he froze. "Oh, shit," the man muttered. Keiru frowned at him. He still looked ready, almost desperate, to bolt, but there was something else that caught Keiru's eye. The man wore a Hite 8 from Kumo across his brow with a deep scratch embedded through the symbol. "I was right," growled Keiru in frustration. "Somebody has it in for me." Chapter 19. Somebody has it in for me. Lee wasn't sure why his newfound comrade sounded so very despondent at the prospect of encountering trouble. But if Keiru-kun didn't feel he could soundly defeat his team's enemies, then Lee would just work twice as hard to prove that it could be done. "Yosh!" Lee cried as he pumped his fist into the air. "A challenger." "A what?" Naruto questioned from beside Lee. Lee glanced at his comrade, but Naruto seemed to be more wary than confused as he stared at the dark-skinned man on the road. "Lee, shut up," Keiru suddenly commanded, turning his head just enough to throw the words back to Lee. Then he looked back to the nuke nin with a Kumo Hite 8. "Who the heck are you?" "Daichi." Lee shifted his feet so that he could look to the back of the party, while Naruto just spun around to face his teammates instead. Standing on the dirt road behind the final 3 members of Team 7 stood a young man and a woman with dark brown hair. Both wore a Hite 8 with the 3 spikes of Kusa on them, both with a deep scratch through the village symbol. Both were missing nin as well. "Yurei Hyuga," growled the Kumo nin, the one called Daichi. "Oh, hell," Keiru muttered. Lee didn't have time to question Keiru's increasing pessimism before Daichi lunged at Neji. Neji held out a hand to knock away the man's first, clumsy blow and spun on his heels, turning away from the charge. Keiru jumped backward in the opposite direction so that Daichi ended up stumbling in between the 2 lead ninja. "I shall assist you, Neji," Lee declared. Really, he wanted to be able to use Gai-sensei's dynamic entry, but it wasn't really possible in this situation. "Hold it right there, brat." The brunette woman suddenly jumped in front of both Lee and Naruto, who looked completely unsure as to which way he was supposed to go. At least the sudden appearance of a new enemy gave him something to focus on. "Hey, I'm not a brat, lady," Naruto jabbed his forefinger rudely at the Kunoichi. Lee saw the woman smile with derision at his young comrade's protest. Before she could say anything, however, another voice suddenly piped up with directions. "Naruto, work with Lee," Keiru shouted from the front of the combined team forces. While he shouted at his younger cousin, as Lee understood Naruto to be Keiru-kun, the dark-skinned ninja in front of Keiru and Neji raised his hand. A sudden bolt of pure white lightning shot out in a jagged dark toward Keiru. "Nisan!" screamed Naruto. But Keiru had already turned back to his opponent, his hand raised with the edge of his hand flat and facing his opponent. The short lightning bolt split itself around Keiru's hand and grazed his shoulders as the older genin divided the attack using only his hand. "Naruto-kun," Lee called urgently. When the blonde ninja faced him, Lee spoke quietly. "Keiru-kun and Neji will be all right. We must attempt to capture this enemy Kunoichi." Naruto drew his brows together, then faced the Kunoichi again. "Asu," he muttered between tight lips, "what do we do?" Yusuke was not happy with the way things were going. He and his mismatched team had completed their reconnaissance and had been in the process of escaping. Until Daichi had stumbled on a Konoha team walking down the road. Given the average age of the members of said team, Yusuke pegged them as genin. But they had at least 2 older ninja, and Yusuke already recognized the gray-haired man. "Sakura, behind Sasuke," ordered Copy Nin Hitaki. Yusuke passed his eyes over the 2 kids beside Hitaki Kakashi. They were kids, likely his students, although Yusuke hadn't heard anything about Hitaki taking students. The boy, Sasuke, pulled out a spool of sharp wire as the girl shifted to stand at his back, watching intently. She had a kunai drawn, but she didn't look much like a threat. Then again, none of the kids really looked much like a threat. The dark boy threaded his wire into 3 shuriken and began his target practice using Yusuke as a base. Yusuke jerked away and batted away one of the weapons so that it fell into the hard ground of the road. He probably could have caught it and sent it back to the kid, just to show how off his power was, but there was still the danger of the kid using the wire he had pulled out to retrieve his weapons, which would slice his hand quite effectively if he managed to grab one of the stars. Hitaki ran through a series of hand signs and slammed his palms down onto the ground. Yusuke braced himself for a jump, recognizing the combination most often used for Doden Jutsu but nothing else. "Moguragakure no Jutsu," Hitaki muttered before his body sank into the ground and out of sight. Yusuke glared at the spot the Junin had disappeared. His chakra sensing abilities weren't quite standard for a Junin, not that he measured himself by his old village's standards anymore. But that didn't repudiate the fact that Yumi would probably be able to tell where the Hitaki was when Yusuke didn't. But Yumi was busy facing off 2 kids of her own. Yusuke had to admit, even in a glance he could tell that both the green-clad kid and the orange one were strong in taijutsu. They weren't letting up on Yumi, even when she sent a barrage of poison-soaked senbon at them. He couldn't demand her attention now. Yusuke settled for facing the boy and girl Hitaki had left behind. "Does your sensei always leave his little kiddies to fight his battles?" he sneered. Surprisingly, the boy only scoffed. All the time, he replied in an annoyed tone. Yusuke didn't have time to contemplate what that could mean before the boy and the girl behind him both charged. The girl made a clumsy stab with her kunai before the dark-haired boy even reached her. Yusuke grabbed the girl's wrist and nearly lifted her off the ground. It was an easy enough task, considering how small and light the girl was. He threw her back towards Yumi. Maybe his partner would be kind enough to deal with another kid for him. The boy was a little more slippery. He avoided Yusuke's attempt to grab him and simply toss him aside like he had the girl. Yusuke withdrew a double-bladed kunai, with a second knife-like blade where konohas had a loop on the end of their kunai. When the boy charged again, Yusuke met the konoha kunai with his own blade and leered in the kid's face. Jumping in without knowing your opponent? Yusuke taunted. That kinda hot-headed behavior'll get ya killed, kid. Yusuke had been reprimanded himself for that kind of behavior, so it stood to reason that he knew what he was talking about. Naruto. Yusuke heard the girl call for one of her teammates and glanced up, ready in case she had decided to join the fight again. But instead the girl was looking at the two genin fighting Yumi. The pink-haired girl held the kid's old shuriken in one hand, the one still attached to a thin line of wire. She must have picked it up from the ground when Yusuke had tossed her aside. The girl flicked the shuriken in Yumi's direction. The bright boy in bright orange clothes reached out and snatched the weapon from the air. Got it. The boy crowed triumphantly. Even genin could get people hurt, Yusuke knew. Maybe it would be best to finish this quickly. He turned his attention back to the dark boy in front of him just in time to see the kid pull out a Fuma shuriken. The kid heaved it through the air, but Yusuke quickly ducked the wide arc of the blades. The shuriken sailed over his head, slicing through the air with a swish. Yusuke straightened and smiled at the genin. You missed, he announced. The kid smirked back. Who said I was aiming for you? Yusuke nearly cracked his neck looking over his shoulders so fast. Hitaki was no less than 3 meters behind him, buried in the ground up to his waist with both his eyes uncovered. He held the kid's shuriken in one hand, and with the other, he reached in front of the windmill blades and grasped the wire Yusuke hadn't seen before. Yusuke followed the line of the wire past him to where Yumi had gotten tangled thanks to the orange kid had caught. The orange kid grinned widely and threw the shuriken in his hand back at Yusuke. Heads. The boy in orange cried. Yusuke raised his kunai again, more from habit than any kind of plan. He saw the current of white radiant chakra a second before the metal in his hand collided with the shuriken on a wire. Every cell in Yusuke's body burned as he knocked the weapon away and looked back at Hitaki. Then he kicked himself backwards and sideways in his head. How could he have forgotten that, underneath all his repertoire of stolen jutsu, Hitaki was the son of Konoha's White Fang. His natural element was lightning. Still holding his double-bladed kunai, Yusuke stretched his free hand to the side and grasped the electric wire. He ignored the burning that sank through his body and cut through the wire with a swift hack. To his right, he heard Yumi groan and slump to the ground. It was enough. Yusuke flung his kunai toward the kid in orange. The kid and his friend in green both jumped backwards, away from where Yumi had fallen to her knees. Yusuke bent down and wrapped his arm around Yumi's shoulders. I'm all right, she gritted out between her teeth. Yusuke chose neither to respond nor to release his grip on her. Daichi, we're leaving, Yusuke called urgently. He didn't trust Daichi to obey orders like Yumi did. Yusuke and Yumi had a history together. They had left Kusa together after a bad mission and had been making their way through the world ever since. They had only taken on Daichi because they needed another hand for their current job. It didn't mean that Yusuke trusted the Kumo Nen. Yusuke leapt backwards and landed on a sturdy branch away from the beaten path. Yumi tucked into his side. Hitaki followed their escape with one of his eyes red and spinning while the 4 kids stared up at the 2 Kumo Nen impetuously. Yusuke was slightly distracted by the fact that Daichi apparently didn't want to leave yet. Daichi! Yusuke shouted again. The dark-skinned ninja scowled in Yusuke's direction then turned back to his fight against the 2 Konoha shinobi. Suddenly, Daichi released a senbon with a flick of his wrist. Hey! Protested the redhead. Yusuke wasn't sure yet what part the redhead played in the Konoha progression. He was obviously older than any of the others, except for Hitaki. And he was a good fighter from what Yusuke had seen of Daichi's battle. As the redhead charged the dark ninja again, Daichi suddenly decided it was in his best interest to leave. The Kumo ninja jumped from the road, letting nearly 100 senbon loose at the pair of Konoha ninja as he flew backwards. Daichi's interest in senbon was a little unusual for a Kumo nin. Yusuke knew Kumo preferred to teach their ninja kenjutsu. But the senbon all headed for the younger ninja, the one with long dark hair down his back. Neji! The redhead exclaimed loudly. The older redhead lunged for his companion, but then stopped short of helping the younger boy. Yusuke frowned for a moment before the dark-haired boy crouched into a low stance with one hand extended in front of him, palm facing up. Then, just as the senbon approached the two boys, the dark-haired one began to spin around in one place. Yusuke saw a visible wall of chakras surround the boy in a sphere. The redhead lifted his arms in front of his face to protect himself from the senbon that deflected off the sphere of chakra that surrounded the boy. Yusuke wasn't an expert on bloodlines and secret judas, but he had lived through the Third Great Shinobi War, and remembered Konoha's strongest fighters. He had seen a ninja once who could do the same things as this boy could. Form a solid defense around himself. The boy was a hyuga. The redhead beside the boy lowered his arms again. Several wooden needles were embedded in the young man's skin, sticking out like hedgehog spines. The redhead looked up at the retreating team without hatred in his eyes, only something resembling annoyance that his enemies were getting away. Then he noticed the redhead's eyes were crimson. He hadn't expected that color on a redhead. In fact, hadn't the boy's eyes been blue when Yusuke studied him before? Daichi landed on a branch next to Yumi and wordlessly took off deeper into the forest. Next time I signal a retreat, I mean immediately, Yusuke hissed in a low tone as he followed the Kumo Nen. We're retreating from a bunch of genin, replied Daichi sullenly. Yusuke neglected to remind him of Sharingan Kakashi's presence, and there was something about that red-headed boy that Yusuke didn't trust. They are not part of our goal, Yumi reminded them both. She's right. Yusuke glanced at Daichi to be sure he was actually retreating. We should stay focused on our mission. Yusuke concentrated on the scenery before him and tried to put crimson eyes with animalistic pupils out of his mind. Keiru swallowed back the fire in his gut and willed it to stay there. He turned to the boy beside him, who looked none the worse for wear after performing his key move. Neji, you okay? Keiru asked, just to confirm. Fine, the hyuga replied shortly. Keiru rolled his eyes. Of course Neji was fine. His damn pride wouldn't allow him to be anything else. Keiru glanced down at his arms and yanked one of the senbon out of his arm. He hadn't been this poked since the first time he had met Haku. As he glanced down at the bloody needle, the skin on his arm started to knit itself back together. Just more proof that the chakra he kept chained up was closer to the surface than he liked. Neji, Lee cried. What was that magnificent new jutsu you have mastered? Keiru already knew the answer, but he was curious as to how Neji would answer, if he deigned to answer at all. Neji brushed off his shirt, flicking away specks of dirt that presumably only his eyes could see. My family jutsu, Kaden, he answered. Your uncle has agreed to train you, demanded Lee eagerly. He looked sincerely ecstatic for his teammate. But Neji's eyes remained on his shirt as his jaw clenched together harshly. Keiru took that small gesture as a negative. Heishi was still blind. You don't have to use Kaden if you have allies around, Keiru blurted. Neji frowned at the redhead. I handled it. Keiru frowned back, ignoring the way Lee's eyes darted from his teammate to his newest acquaintance. He was too busy glaring at the Hyuga Genuus. This was even worse than trying to get Sasuke Teme to accept help in training. Yeah, don't tell me, you saw it coming from 50 meters away, right? Keiru scoffed. Who are you trying to prove wrong, Neji? Me or your own family? What? The way Neji's milky pale eyes widened was probably a clue that Keiru was pushing too hard, but he didn't pay attention to it. Keiru knew this boy could be great, would be great. Neji was probably the strongest to come out of the Hyuga clan since Heishi himself had fought in the Third Great Shinobi War. Of course, Keiru had only heard that from the older clan members since neither Neji nor Hinata had talked about it much after they had fled Konoha. But Neji was strong. He just wasn't that strong now. Don't start ranting to me about fate, Neji, Keiru commanded firmly. Not when I know how hard you're working to change it. If you didn't care about your position, you wouldn't have bothered to learn Kaden on your own. Neji just stared, like he couldn't find the necessary composure back to glower at Keiru. Keiru-kun. A startled voice called urgently. Keiru nearly flinched as he turned away from Neji and looked over Lee's head to the other half of his team. Sakura had one hand raised to cover her mouth as she shouted, and Naruto was waving urgently. You guys okay back there? Keiru shouted louder than necessary. Kakashi was overseeing the 3 members of Team 7, still in their defensive positions from fighting against the Kiriku no Ichi. They looked like a team, even without his presence. Yeah, Keiru-ni-san, Naruto called back proudly. Kakashi scanned the edge of the forest where the rogue team had diswet his eyes briefly, but he doubted he'd find anything. That group seemed eager to leave, and Keiru's team had no obligation to chase after random missing nen. Keiru slowly trooped toward the original Team 7. Neji wasn't talking to him, anyway. We're not going after them, Sasuke demanded. Some hunter nen will probably be after them, answered Kakashi. A real one this time? Naruto asked, half in doubt and half actually curious. Keiru just scoffed and pulled out another senbon. Yeah, probably a real one this time, Gaki, he answered. Keiru looked up at Kakashi, half ready for reprimand, as he continued to remove the needles from his arms. Then, he caught a glimpse of Kakashi's eye, crinkled at the corner the way he did when he was smiling beneath his mask. Keiru dropped the last of the enemy senbon as his gaze turned suspicious and narrow. Did you know they were coming? Keiru demanded. It would be within Kakashi's power, and even his desire, to sense the mismatched team of shinobi coming and decide to use it as a test for Keiru, if he were still suspicious about the redhead. Keiru knew Kakashi didn't quite believe in Keiru's sudden, miraculous appearance for the sake of Konoha's single jinchuriki, but Kakashi would never put his students in danger, even over someone who could be a spy. Ma. Kakashi waved one hand through the air by his head. I didn't know until Neji saw them. But you did well with the unexpected surprise, Keiru-kun. Would you like to try again? Oh, no, Keiru crossed his arms in front of his emphatically. You be in charge, Kakashi-sensei. I want to walk with Naruto. Yeah, Naruto agreed enthusiastically. Kakashi shrugged as if it didn't make any difference to him. Naruto was happy to fall in beside his cousin as Kakashi stepped forward to take point in between Neji and Lee. Keiru didn't look ahead to meet either of their gazes. He had had enough of stuck-up geniuses and trying to change people when he wasn't quite sure what had inspired the change in the first place. Maybe he should have offered to walk with Sasuke, but he wasn't sure what to say to that genius, either. Naruto was the easiest. The most familiar. Keiru knew how Naruto would respond to teaching or challenges, and he had a better idea of what Naruto would need in future years than anyone else. Are you alright, Ni-san? Demanded Naruto. Keiru shifted his gaze to his would-be cousin and forced himself to smile. Yeah, I'm fine. Even your arms? Naruto asked with a pointed stare at the long sleeves that hid Keiru's seals. Keiru followed Naruto's stare down to his arms. His arms weren't in any danger, that he knew. The wounds weren't large enough to disrupt the seals, and they were already healing, so he wouldn't lose much blood. But no one else knew that. Keiru looked up to where Kakashi was staring back at the rear of his party expectantly. Go on ahead, Keiru said abruptly. Naruto's going to help me with my wounds. Do you need first aid, Keiru-kun? Demanded Sakura eagerly. She took a step forward as if she were about to pounce on Keiru if he indicated even the slightest need for a bandage. It's all right, Sakura-chan. Keiru waved at her, or tried to. His nerves still tingled even if the wounds themselves were pretty much closed. At the girl's disbelieving look, Keiru smiled instead. It's fine. Naruto should learn this anyway, we'll catch up. Very well, was all Kakashi said, we'll be sure to walk slow. The Junin turned and led the way down the road again. For a moment, Keiru wondered if it was a trick, and Kakashi was just pretending to leave them alone. But his mind was too busy focused on hurrying to get the job done. Keiru knelt in the middle of the road and slipped the pack off his back. I need my bandages, he instructed Naruto. Are you hurt? Naruto immediately began digging through the messy pack and pulled out a roll of cloth bandages. Not really. Keiru pushed his sleeves to bunch up above his elbows and held out his arms to prove it to Naruto. All that was left of the senbon wounds was a circle of pink skin where each needle had punctured his arm. Naruto stared at Keiru's arms, his eyes following the designs of the inked seals. Tie the bandages around my arm so it covers all the skin. Keiru held out his left arm, palm upturned, to Naruto. But you're not hurt, Naruto protested, glancing up at his cousin. Kakashi-sensei doesn't know that, Keiru said hurriedly. He would be surprised if I didn't need bandages. Naruto just shook his head and made no move to aid Keiru's deception. I don't get it. You told Sakura-chan and Sasuke Teme that it was a bloodline we shared, the fast healing thing. I lied, blurted Keiru. Naruto's eyes shot up to meet Keiru's blue gaze. Keiru grit his teeth against a sigh. I told Sakura and Sasuke that it was a bloodline because they don't know anything about Kyuubi, he explained. But it's the Yuki that lets both of us heal so fast. The demon doesn't want us to die. Naruto swallowed hard and lowered his eyes to the dirt beneath both of their feet. So, you're like me? Keiru nearly bit his own tongue and wondered just how good he would be able to lie to a pint-sized version of what he had been, or maybe could have been. Not exactly, Keiru sighed. Listen, there are 9 different biju, tailed beasts with different numbers of tails. Ichibi to Kyuubi. When a biju is sealed within a human being, the human is called a jinchuriki. Jinchuriki, Naruto repeated, as if committing the term to memory. It means, power of human sacrifice. Keiru had always thought the term was far too appropriate for a host of a tailed beast. Not only was the host forced to sacrifice any chance of living like a normal human, someone had to die to seal a biju. Naruto's gaze rose again to Keiru's. You're not a jinchuriki? He asked desperately. Keiru shook his head a little desperately. There's only 9, the older boy answered honestly, and seals don't always have to hold back tailed beasts. Yuki can be sealed, too. I've seen people with evil power sealed into just one part of their body. There had been that kid with the freaky-looking hand, and a dozen experiments of both Orochimarus and Danzos that probably qualified. Keiru's stomach twisted guiltily at the thought of deliberately misleading the kid before him, but he didn't want anyone to know his secret, not even Naruto. The seals are fine, Gaki, he reassured Naruto. But Kakashi knows that you heal so fast because of Kyuubi. He doesn't know about me. Understanding seemed to creep into Naruto's eyes as they took on a steadfast, determined look. Naruto nodded once and then unfurled the bandage. "Yash," he murmured over Keiru's left arm. "Let's hurry and catch up with the others soon." Keiru held still and let the kid work as carefully as he dared. He hoped the others wouldn't get too far ahead, but Kakashi wouldn't let that happen. Keiru was still a bit nervous about what Kakashi thought of the attack and the result. The missing nin team probably wasn't a danger to Keiru and his team considering how fast they wanted to get away from a bunch of genin. Although, Keiru thought with a mental sigh as Naruto progressed to his right arm, knowing his luck, he'd probably get roped into whatever mission the missing shinobi had despite his best intentions. Hikui was a fairly large town. Not as large as Konoha itself, but it was bigger than Tazuna's little town in Wave. And those were the only two cities that Naruto could compare his current setting with. But some things were familiar, too. The way people tried to avoid bumping each other as they walked down the street and the way neighbors called out to friends were all things that Naruto recognized. Kakashi led the joined team down the middle of the street nonchalantly. Naruto and Keiru had ended up at the back of the pack. Stupid Sasuke was walking on Keiru's other side because he claimed if he spent any more time walking by either Sakura-chan or Lee, the guy with the crazy eyebrows, he would just laugh and let Sasuke walk along without saying anything. Naruto stopped his chakra channeling exercise as soon as they entered the city. Too many distractions, anyway. Keiru was looking all over the village, too, but it wasn't quite the same as Naruto's looks, he noticed. Keiru barely turned his head while his eyes darted around, looking at the people, the buildings, and the other Konoha shinobi in front of them. Then, Keiru's eyes slid over to look at Naruto. "Hey, how do you do that eye thing, Keiru ni?" Naruto demanded now that he had Keiru's attention. "What eye thing?" Keiru suddenly jerked, as if Naruto had hit him. The older boy raised a hand to his face and turned it over to study both the palm and his fingers. Then he looked down at his body and frowned. "That shifty eye thing." Naruto quickly squinted his eyes almost shut and glared at Sasuke from the corner of his eye just to prove he knew the bastard was listening, like that. Keiru let out a huff of air in a scoff that was almost a chuckle. "Not quite like that," he drawled. "You look like you're trying to creep someone out." "Like that would work on anyone," Sasuke commented from Keiru's other side. Naruto leaned forward suddenly and flipped up his middle finger at Sasuke. Then, a hand rested on the top of his head and pulled him back. "Still gotta work on your eyes, Gaki." Keiru ruffled Naruto's hair a bit and kept facing forward. Sasuke leaned forward to look around Keiru and lifted his eyebrows at Naruto in a smug gaze. Naruto's lips wrinkled into a sneer of his own. "I can see you, you know," commented Keiru blandly. Naruto just turned his face up to his cousin and stuck out his tongue. Instead of reprimanding him, or laughing like Naruto expected, Keiru drew a deep breath into his lungs through his teeth. Then he laced his fingers together and rested his hands on top of his head. He looked tired. "Ah, here we are," Kakashi-sensei suddenly announced. Naruto looked up at the building Kakashi-sensei had pointed out. It was a small, wooden store, like the bookstore in Konoha that Naruto passed by sometimes. Kakashi entered the door easily as Neji and Lee followed behind. Naruto hopped up the Ingawa and poked his head into the door before Keiru gave him a nudge with his foot. "Get in already," Keiru commanded. Naruto craned his neck to look up and over his shoulder at the older boy. He squinted his eyes shut to glare again, happy when Keiru ni actually stuck his tongue out back at the kid instead of just looking tired. Inside, the shop really did look like a bookstore, or, at least, it looked like how Naruto imagined a bookstore would look. He had never been in one to know firsthand. The walls were lined with shelves filled with books, along with some freestanding bookshelves placed randomly in the middle of the floor. A man with dark hair, graying at the temples, sat at a plain wooden table. He wore a thin pair of spectacles balanced on his nose as he hunched over his table, peering at a collection of papers in his hands. At the sound of footsteps over his wooden floor, the man looked up and squinted at his new guests. "Can I help you?" he asked. Kakashi stepped forward and withdrew the mission scroll from his pocket. "We're just making a delivery from the Hokage to Kusunoki Akira-san," answered the Junin. "That would be me." The middle-aged man pressed his palms flat on his desk and pushed himself to his feet with a creak of his joints. "Ah." Kakashi's eye crinkled the way it always did when the man smiled beneath his mask. "This is for you, then." Kakashi held out a small scroll to the man, "Akira-san," and Akira took it easily, adjusting his glasses to study the scroll. Naruto bounced on his heels a bit and waited for the older man to finish reading over the scroll so they could go and Naruto could start on his training again. He heard a chortle from beside him and looked up quickly. Keiru was ducking his head so that his chin was tucked into his chest as his shoulders shook with silent laughter. Naruto frowned and poked the older boy in his side. "Oi, what's so funny?" he demanded. Keiru just grinned and pointed at Neji, who was standing in front of a short bookcase in one corner that was filled with books bound in orange covers. "Hey, isn't that Kakashi-sensei's perverted book?" Naruto asked loudly. Neji jumped from his perusal of the bookshelf with an evident blush on his face. Keiru clapped one hand over his mouth and muffled loud chuckles from the rest of his team. Neji glared at both Naruto and Keiru, but the effect was somewhat diminished by the line of pink across the bridge of his nose, staining his otherwise pale skin. "Baka," hissed Sakura-chan. Naruto raised his shoulders in an instinctively protective gesture. Sakura-chan could get violent when she got mad. "All right," Kakashi announced suddenly, "we're done here." Naruto looked up in surprise. That didn't take very much time at all. "Are we leaving for Konoha right away?" Keiru asked from behind Naruto. Naruto wondered if Keiru wanted to get back home. He knew there was nothing wrong with Keiru's arms, and even his seals seemed whole and not in need of any painting over. But maybe Keiru just didn't want to show his seals off where others could see them. Maybe he was waiting until they got back home to uncover his arms again. Kakashi looked at Keiru and shook his head slowly. "The Hokage isn't expecting us back until tomorrow," Kakashi-sensei explained. "We'll stay at an inn here for tonight." Naruto saw his older cousin frown, but then Keiru nodded easily and shrugged. Naruto studied Keiru as the team walked out of the bookstore, but Keiru didn't look like he was nervous or afraid. Naruto decided he would keep an eye on Keiru and make sure he was okay. Kakashi found it easy to book 2 rooms for the night at the inn in Hikui. The innkeeper was happy to be considered helpful to shinobi of Konoha, and Kakashi felt he only needed 2 rooms for the 2 genin teams. Sakura had spent enough time camping and training with her teammates that it wouldn't be too awkward for her to share a room with Naruto and Sasuke. Neji and Lee had been teammates for over a year and would be fine on their own. Kakashi was seriously considering bunking with his own team and sending Keiru to sleep with Guy's boys, but he was more interested in keeping an eye on the Uzumaki boys. Naruto had been keeping close to Keiru since the attack on the road. Closer than usual. Kakashi knew that the boy had attached himself to his supposed cousin with the tenacity he showed in everything, but Kakashi suspected this new closeness had something to do with the attack. Naruto was acting almost protective of Keiru. "Ninja-san." Kakashi turned toward the insistent voice even as his senses picked up the presence of a civilian running toward his team. He noticed that Keiru had already turned around so that his back was to the reception desk and he faced the man hurrying toward the conglomerated team. The man was fairly corpulent and stumbled into the inn, panting. His finely made haori made Kakashi guess that he was an official of some kind in Hikui. The man seemed to regain his breath quickly and straightened once again, looking at Kakashi. "Are you the team of ninja that I requested from Konoha?" he demanded. "We are here on a courier mission," was all Kakashi said in response. He hadn't heard anything about a mission to Hikui besides the one Hokage-sama had given him. And that mission was specifically for the Hokage, not some Makibugyo who had no connection with Konoha except as a client. "But I requested a team from Konoha to protect my home," protested the magistrate. "I guard a very special treasure in my home until the daimyo can send his samurai to retrieve the jewel." "Jewel?" interjected Sakura curiously. Kakashi glanced at the lone kunoichi and their party and wondered if he should have taken the time to lecture her on how being a ninja was decidedly not a romantic profession. "It is a jewel that is able to channel chakra," said the Makibugyo excitedly. "Much you ninja use." Whatever romantic ideas Sakura might have had seemed to diminish when she was lumped into a group of "you ninja" by the man. She scowled at him before lowering her head so that her hair hid most of her face from view. At least she knew not to insult the man too badly. "When did you submit this request to Konoha?" Kakashi asked. "Yesterday. We have only just departed from Konoha this morning," Kakashi deadpanned. The magistrate clapped his hands together excitedly. What wonderful promptness. Kakashi heard a snort to one side and glanced at Keiru. Unlike Sakura, Keiru didn't even bother hiding the skeptical look on his face. As a result, Naruto had already started sneering at the large man, and Sasuke looked at the man as if he was just barely restraining himself from rolling his eyes at the magistrate's stupidity. The magistrate, meanwhile, seemed completely oblivious to this as he waved one hand back to the door of the inn. "Come, I will escort you to my home," he announced. Kakashi held up one hand to forestall any more of the man's plans. "We are not here to, but you must help me," cried the magistrate. His expression had morphed from jubilation to desperation in the space of 5 words. "I have already had bandits attack my guards." "If you have guards, why bother to call for a team of shinobi?" challenged Sasuke. "My guards are not trained to deal with nuke nen," the magistrate snapped back, apparently annoyed at being forced to answer to a child. "The bandits are missing nen?" Kakashi actually turned his head to look at Keiru. The skepticism had fallen from his face, and his eyes had grown wide with worry as he questioned the magistrate. "Yes, a pair from Kusa and one strange one from Kumo," answered the magistrate. Well, that was interesting. Kakashi didn't want to assume that the 3 nuke nin they had met on the road outside Hikui were the same as the magistrate's hated bandits. Keiru, on the other hand, seemed free to assume. "Figures. The young man muttered so low Kakashi doubted even Naruto heard his cousin. Just figures. I should start begging Inari for a break. Deciding that now was not the best time or place to question why Keiru thought he was cursed by the deity of foxes, Kakashi turned back to the magistrate. We are sorry, he said firmly, but our mission does not include guard duty. The Hokage will review your request and send a team later. For a moment, Kakashi thought the magistrate would argue further, but then the man sighed and tapped the top of his head with his palm. Well, at least let me offer you a place to stay for the night, the man offered. You are all welcome to rest at my home. That way you won't have to pay for the inn. Kakashi saw the young woman behind the reception desk scowl at the magistrate. He already knew that the magistrate was trying to get some free help out of Kakashi's team. By using the incentive of a free night's stay, the magistrate was hoping that having ninja in his house would deter any bandits, nuke nin or otherwise. And he wouldn't have to pay for any mission fee if he was just offering hospitality. Kakashi glanced over at Keiru to gauge the young man's reaction. Keiru was back to shooting a dubious look at the magistrate. Keiru-kun? Keiru's eyes snapped to Kakashi suspiciously. Then, Keiru lifted both hands in a mockery of surrender and shrugged his shoulders deliberately. Not in charge anymore, Kakashi-sensei, he reminded the Junin. You pick. Kakashi was hoping for a little more insight than that. He had only heard the beginnings of Keiru's conversation with Naruto on the road, but it was enough to know that Keiru knew more about demons and hosts than what Sandame had merely told him concerning Kyuubi. Hey, Naruto suddenly called. We should go with the guy. Kakashi shifted his one-eyed gaze to the young, enthusiastic blonde while the magistrate smiled widely. However, Naruto was far from his usual enthusiastic self. His eyes glanced worriedly from the magistrate to Keiru. We can stay in his house tonight and save money, right? Naruto asked, to his cousin more than anyone, with the tone of a student hoping he had gotten an answer correct. Kakashi waited for Keiru's response, but the redhead only stared at Kakashi expectantly. Apparently, Keiru had used up all his potential for leadership skills on the road outside Hikui. Meanwhile, the rest of the kids were staring at Kakashi expectantly while the elderly man stood still wringing his hands together. Kakashi sighed. Fine. We'll accept your offer. Naruto was right about one thing. It wasn't a bad idea to save some money. War wasn't necessarily good for a village's coffers, but neither was peace. With no one to fight, the village got less missions and thus less funds. The Hokage wouldn't mind if they saved the cost of an inn on this trip. And if Kakashi could find out how much Keiru knew about Biju and how the hell he knew it, so much the better. Chapter 20. You're on first watch, Yusuke commanded abruptly as the Kumo nin sank to the ground in the dimness of twilight. Daichi shot a glare at Yusuke, the self-proclaimed leader for the mission, but he didn't reply. He was still stewing over the retreat. That boy had been a Hyuga. The ninja are staying with the magistrate now, Daichi announced in a sullen voice. With Yumi already sleeping off the effects of being electrocuted and Yusuke fussing over his female companion, Daichi had been the one to scout out the town for the next possible attack. All the while he had obeyed Yusuke's infuriating command not to attack the Konoha ninja or draw attention to himself in any way. The people of Hikui were pathetic anyway. They never once sensed his presence. And he had stayed far enough away from the party of baby ninja that not even the teacher had detected his presence. But he had seen the team walk away with the magistrate toward his house where Yusuke's goal remained. Yusuke frowned at the news. Stealing the jewel will be more difficult now, he murmured. They are baby ninja, scoffed Daichi. We should have finished them off on the road. Yusuke's gaze snapped to Daichi. We're not looking to shed more blood than we have to, he said firmly. Killing 5 genin would attract Konoha's attention, and we don't need that. Daichi snorted loudly through his nose. Konoha could go rot for all he cared. Yusuke was too timid. We'll observe them for a while before we decide what to do. Yusuke touched Yumi's forehead as he spoke. Daichi didn't think the two shinobi were lovers. There wasn't enough closeness or enough tension to indicate that. But they shared a bond. That much was obvious, even to Daichi. In some quiet part of his mind that had not spoken aloud in some years, Daichi could admit that he knew what it was like to exercise caution simply for the sake of one person's safety. But he no longer had that bond. It had been severed. And that Hyuga boy was the cause. Daichi shifted in the quiet night as Yusuke sat next to his comrade to rest. Daichi could appreciate Yusuke's bond, but Yusuke would never be able to understand Daichi's loss. The most Daichi could hope for was that the Hyuga would feel the same pain as he did. If he had to abandon Yusuke's goal to meet his own of revenge, Daichi would do so without hesitation. The mansion of the magistrate was on the western edge of town, surrounded by a large wall made out of planks of wood, smoothed down by endless hours of toil. The building itself was decorated with curved points on the roof, and the taimansho was larger than the interior of the bookstore in town. It was the kind of place built to show off one's wealth. It was the kind of place that reminded Sasuke a bit of the buildings once located in the Uchiha complex in Konoha. Sasuke kept his head forward as he walked through the gardens of the mansion. He was not interested in being here or in guarding the old man's treasure. Whatever it was, Kakashi was being a pushover, letting Keiru call so many shots on this mission. Sasuke didn't even know why Kakashi wanted Keiru to be in charge so much. Keiru himself had said that he was only a genin, and Kakashi was a junin. Granted, Keiru knew some things that Sasuke didn't, but that was only because he was older. Then again, hadn't Keiru said that he recognized Sasuke's eyes? Sasuke kicked at a loose stone in his path. It had been one of the first things Uzumaki Keiru had said to him, that line about Sasuke's eyes, and it still bothered Sasuke. He hadn't had his Sharingan unveiled at the time. He hadn't even awoken his Sharingan. So, why did Keiru comment on his eyes? A voice ahead of him pulled Sasuke out of his musings. Someone was counting loudly. 127, 128. Sasuke recognized Lee's voice easily as he kept walking. It was only because the path led this way that he was going to see what Lee was up to, Sasuke told himself. He wasn't curious. As he rounded a large rhododendron bush, Sasuke saw Lee in a taijutsu stance, counting off punches as he alternated his hands. "Good evening, Sasuke-kun," Lee cried upon seeing he had company. "I am completing my evening routine as commanded by Gai-sensei." Sasuke paused long enough to wonder what it would be like to have a sensei coaching his taijutsu. He had his own routine of warm-ups and cool-downs, but he had come up with that on his own, and Kakashi never really commented on his taijutsu performance. The only time he had ever gotten any coaching was when Keiru had stopped to visit with Team 7 and ended up sparring. Sasuke pushed the thought from his mind with an almost physical shudder. He realized that Lee had stopped his taijutsu routine to stand in front of Sasuke. "I would like to fight you sometime, Sasuke-kun," Lee said in a much calmer voice than he usually used. "You're the last of the Uchiha clan, and you were the rookie of the year in your class at the academy." Sasuke frowned at both mentions of his accomplishments. Being the only survivor of a massacre simply because you weren't worth killing wasn't something to be proud of. And what good was being rookie of the year if no one was there to congratulate you? "You want to fight me?" Sasuke confirmed with a glare. "Let's go." Lee's eyebrows, monstrous things, those, rose up in surprise. "Now? Yes, now," snapped Sasuke impatiently. He allowed his mouth to quirk into a crooked smile. "Unless you're afraid I'll beat you." Sasuke found taunts were usually the best way to goad his opponent into doing what he wanted. It worked on Naruto, anyway. But Lee only pumped one fist into the air triumphantly. "Very well," he cried. "We shall have a battle." Sasuke barely had time to adjust his legs to a defensive stance and raise his hands before Lee charged. As it was, Sasuke still had to jerk to his right to avoid Lee's sudden right jab. Lee followed up with a roundhouse kick, and Sasuke quickly switched his arms to cross in front of him. The force of the kick sent Sasuke skidding across the dirt, struggling to keep his balance. Sasuke snapped himself back to attention and looked up, but Lee didn't press his advantage. He only waited until Sasuke had regained his defensive position before he charged again. Sasuke focused on his eyes and willed himself to see more clearly. Time seemed to slow, and he could see Lee's movements. Sasuke inhaled and thrust his palm in a strike where he predicted Lee's fist would be. But his palm, instead of batting Lee's fist away, only grazed against an arm that was already halfway through the strike. Sasuke blinked, only once, and looked into Lee's face, trying to determine how his Sharingan had read Lee's moves so wrong. Then, Lee's fist connected with Sasuke's chest. Sasuke felt all the air leave his lungs as his mouth hung open, trying and failing to take in more oxygen. He saw a green blur from the corner of his eye and tried to raise a hand to block the incoming kick. His arm protected the side of his head from the direct impact of Lee's roundhouse kick, but the force of it sent Sasuke flying. Sasuke slid across the ground on his back, feeling the skin on his arm burn. His head hurt. Lee. Someone new was in the garden. Sasuke blinked to clear his vision. That blow to his head must have caused his Sharingan to deactivate. He looked up to see a shock of bright red hair stomping across the gardens. "Stop beating up your teammate," commanded Keiru, the harsh tone of his voice taking most of the humor out of his wry smile. Sasuke pushed himself to his feet more slowly than he liked as Lee immediately dropped his hands and straightened into a more relaxed stance. "Oh, Keiru-kun," Lee greeted in surprise. Keiru nodded at Lee, then used his thumb to point over his shoulder at the great house. "I think Sakura-chan could use some help," he announced blandly. The effect was immediate. "Yosh, I will do my best to aid the lovely cherry blossom of Konoha." Lee sped toward the mansion without glancing back once. Keiru's eyes followed as he leapt onto the Engawa and disappeared into the house, presumably to search for Sakura. Then, Keiru turned to look back at Sasuke. Keiru looked, on the whole, rather unconcerned with Sasuke's state. Sasuke noticed that the older boy had replaced his typical long-sleeved shirt with a short-sleeved one and had white bandages wrapped around his arms from his elbows down to his palms. Other than that, he looked unharmed from the encounter on the road. Keiru carefully slipped his hands into his pockets and lifted one corner of his mouth into an expectant smile. "Learn anything?" he demanded. The question was familiar in a way Sasuke didn't particularly want to think about. He concentrated on determining what went wrong with his fight instead. How did he? Sasuke started to point after Lee's disappearance, but then he realized that he was dripping blood from his elbow all the way down his fingertips. Sasuke stared at his injured arm, wondering how he hadn't noticed the ground scrape a better part of his skin off. Keiru grinned widely. "All the foresight in the world won't help you if you can't move out of the way in time," he announced. "You need to be faster." Keiru turned on his heel and started to stroll back to the house, leaving Sasuke in the garden. Sasuke dropped his hand back down to his side and stared after Keiru. The older boy seemed determined to teach him, and Sasuke didn't know why. Or he could be simply making fun of Sasuke's ignorance, but if that were the case, Sasuke suspected Keiru would be a bit more prideful in his knowledge. Keiru tended to point out Sasuke's flaws nonchalantly. Still, Sasuke was sure that this weakness was something Keiru knew about as well. "You know how," he called to the back, slowly leaving him alone. Keiru knew how to make Sasuke stronger. That was all Sasuke needed, really. The redhead looked over his shoulder with a wide grin that reminded Sasuke forcibly of Naruto. "Would I want to bet I can beat you in a foot race?" Keiru demanded. Sasuke frowned. So he needed to be faster. So be it. Without a word of warning, he bolted past Keiru and sped toward the house. Just before he reached the Ingawa, he heard a boast from behind him. "Last one around the house has to bow to Kakashi-sensei." Neji stood on the slanted roof of the magistrate's mansion and gazed out at the small town. He wasn't sure why the man was so nervous about his precious jewel. It was little more than a crystal that stored an unusual amount of chakra for an inanimate object. Suddenly, Neji heard something clatter behind him, and he spun around, his hands extended flat in front of him. "Hey!" Keiru greeted him with a large grin. Neji dropped his hands and tried not to let his exasperation show. It was one thing to be annoyed with his own teammates, as was frequently the case with Lee. But Uzumaki Keiru was his elder, even if he did hold the same rank as Neji did. Plus, there was the strange attentiveness that Kakashi-sensei always seemed to pin on the older boy. Keiru was not as simplistic as Lee, no matter what he may pretend. Keiru held a small round tray in one hand with two ceramic mugs balanced on it. He smiled at Neji as if he could not recognize the boy's wish to be alone. "Some girl thought you might like some tea while you're up here," Keiru announced. "I think she was a maid or something. I told her I could get up on the roof easier." Neji did not care about maids or tea, and he had no wish to try to make conversation with the older Uzumaki, as curious as Uzumaki Keiru's sheer existence seemed to be. Besides, Neji was still angry at Keiru for his comment on Neji's kaiden. It had taken Neji the better part of 2 years to nail down the key technique in the Hyuga's style of fighting. And even then, he was forced to learn simply by observation, trial, and error. And each error had cost him. There had been times where his skin had nearly been ripped off from the force of expelling chakra from his tenketsu. But Neji had finally done it. That time on the road had been only his third successful attempt since mastering kaiden. The analytical part of his mind recognized that he shouldn't have performed it when an ally was close at hand. The jutsu did extend 360 degrees. But the larger part of him was angry for needing a red-headed idiot who knew nothing about his family to point out his own mistakes. He should have seen it himself. "I do not want tea," Neji told Keiru coolly and hoped that would end the conversation. Neji turned around again and faced the small village. Behind him, he could hear a heavy sigh, almost exaggerated. "Don't have to be such an ass about it," Keiru muttered, suddenly closer to Neji's back than he thought the older boy had been. There was a clatter of ceramics as Neji turned to watch Keiru set the tray with the 2 green teas down on the flat roof. Neji scowled in the general direction of the tea tray rather than shoot Keiru an actual glare for the insult. He could smell the sharpness of matcha coming from the steaming cup. Grudgingly, Neji wrapped his hands around the warm cup and lifted it to his lips. At least the magistrate didn't skimp on the quality of his tea. "Thank you," Neji muttered, more out of duty than anything else. Keiru lowered himself to sit on the edge of the roof with his legs dangling freely in the air. "Even when you're polite, you sound like an ass." Keiru picked up the remaining cup of tea and sipped at it. As soon as the liquid touched his tongue, Keiru grimaced at the cup, as if he had been expecting something else. He replaced the tea on the tray and laced his fingers together, resting his joined hands behind his head. Neji scowled and took another sip of tea so that he wouldn't have to meet Keiru's eyes and be accused of glaring again. Had the younger Uzumaki, Naruto, been the one to bring him tea and call him names, Neji wouldn't have hesitated to call the boy out, or at least put him back in his place. Uzumaki Naruto was a loser. Neji wasn't sure he could say the same of Naruto's older brother. "You don't have the right to tell me how to act," Neji dared to say before he sipped his tea to conceal his frown. It wasn't as if Keiru was connected to Neji in any way. He wasn't a family member. He wasn't even a teammate, really. This was only a temporary setup, and Uzumaki Keiru could claim no permanent tie that would allow him the intimacy of correcting Neji's behavior. Keiru's hands flew from their relaxed position behind his head and slapped with a clatter on the edge of the tiled roof. The sound almost made Neji jump, but he kept his composure, even when Keiru's eyes snapped to pin Neji with a sharp gaze. "I get it. You don't respect me." Keiru huffed quietly and leaned back as he crossed his arms over his chest, a direct contrast to the straight spine and sharp eyes Neji had seen only a moment before. Neji didn't refute Keiru's claims. After all, they were true. But he did think of something that had bothered him earlier in the day. "You recognized the Kaiden," Neji said. He meant to state a fact, the way he had heard his uncle speak calmly and coldly, but it came out sounding like an accusation. Either way, it didn't seem to bother Keiru, who just shrugged and tilted his head back to look at the night sky. "Yeah, I've seen it before," he answered casually. "I know how the Hyuga work." For some reason, Neji's forehead felt hot, like he had developed a sudden fever. He sipped at the tea in his hands, trying to calm the words that vaulted in his chest, banging against his ribs in their quest to escape his tightly closed mouth. "Then you know I am bound by fate," Neji said once he was sure his voice wouldn't waver or crack. "I was branded from the moment I could walk." It was probably slightly after that, actually. Neji threw the rest of his tea down his throat, not caring about the way it burned the back of his tongue. How dare Keiru cast aside Neji's own memories, as if he would know better than Neji. "You know nothing about my curse," he spat before rising to his feet. His head swam for a moment, heaved together. It had been a long time since he had gotten dizzy just from standing up too fast. It almost felt like there was too little blood in his head. As such, it took Neji a good moment to realize that the reason he wasn't stomping across the roof and back into the house like he had planned on doing was because Keiru had a grip on his wrist, holding him in place. Neji forced himself to focus on Keiru's face as the older boy frowned up at Neji, looking very displeased with the boy's behavior. "You really think you're the only one who knows about curses?" Keiru demanded in a harsh whisper. "At least you can escape yours. Mine's killing me." Neji tore his arm from Keiru's grasp and opened his mouth to command him to stop being so dramatic. But Keiru's eyes were so serious that Neji didn't doubt that Keiru at least believed what he was saying, even if it wasn't entirely accurate. Neji felt suddenly sick and closed his mouth to keep his stomach firmly in place. He turned his back on the genin sitting on the edge of the roof and started walking toward the slanted wall where he could easily slip back inside. Strangely, the roof seemed to be moving beneath his feet. Neji's vision swarmed, and he tried to gain enough control to unleash his dujutsu. It would be silly to call upon the Byakugan for something as simple as walking across a roof, but Neji needed the extra sharpness to see where he was going. He couldn't even tell where the roof dropped off into the darkness of night. As Neji reached for his chakra, any control he might have had slipped away from his questing senses, and his vision blacked out completely. He could only think how much he hated being so weak in front of Keiru, who knew so much and prodded where he had no right to. "Neji!" Daichi heard the older, red-headed boy cry out as his target collapsed onto the roof, and Daichi realized that he couldn't wait any longer. He couldn't risk the other genin staging a rescue or sounding an alarm. With a quick transportation jutsu, Daichi landed on the roof with a soft clatter, stooping down to pick up the unconscious Hyuga boy. "You!" snapped the redhead. So, obviously the teenager was aware enough to recognize Daichi from their encounter earlier. Daichi cast a quick glance toward the edge of the roof, where one cup stood empty, drained of its contents, while the other was still more than half full. It wasn't an ideal situation, but it was only Daichi thought he could turn to his advantage. At least he would be getting out of here with his prize. The redhead leapt to his feet and then immediately wobbled as if his legs wouldn't hold him upright. "What did you do?" The glare the redhead shot him was worthy of his hair color, but Daichi wasn't worried. "It seems not many of the magistrate's people are too fond of the one who rules them," Daichi informed the still shaky genin. "It was easy to bribe one of them into giving you the tea." The boy's eyes darted over to the tray with 2 cups on it, but then he went back to glaring at Daichi. "You poisoned it," he spat. "It was effective," Daichi shrugged. Granted, it would have been more effective if both the boys had drunk the tea, but there was just no pleasing some people. As it was, Daichi suspected the boy was incapacitated enough to prevent him from following. Daichi wrapped his arms beneath the Hyuga's body and lifted the limp boy up, slinging the body over his shoulder like a sack of rice. The redhead jerked forward and fell to his knees on the roof tiles. "Give him back, Yuru!" yelled the redhead. Daichi turned to face the forest beyond the great house overlooking the village of Hikui. He glanced over his shoulder and saw that the boy had managed to push himself so that one foot rested beneath him, his hands heavy on one knee. "Stop me," he called, and jumped off the roof into the dark forest. This was not good. Keiru heaved himself to his feet and tried to think that he was on a boat instead of the supposedly solid roof he was supposed to be on. At least the rocking made sense that way. Keiru drew to a stop at the edge of the roof, nearly tripping headfirst over the side as his arms spun in pinwheels to keep his balance. But as much as he stared into the dark forest, He couldn't see Neji or the Kumo nuke nin who had taken him. This was definitely not good. Kaoru swallowed back something thick and acidic at the back of his throat and blinked hard. His stomach didn't feel any better for the action, but his eyesight became a bit clearer. Kaoru lifted his hands to his chest and crossed them into a familiar sign. One puff of smoke later, Kaoru stared into his mirror image beside him. "Tell Kakashi-sensei what happened," he ordered. "Asu." The clone snapped off a salute, no less respectful for it being less than sharp, and started running down the side of the building. At least the clone seemed like he had the balance thing under control. With a deep breath, Kaoru launched himself off the roof and into the forest. He was a little surprised that he landed firmly on a large branch, but he saved that feeling for later when he could enjoy it and kept going. The Kumo missing nin could have poisoned the whole team, Kaoru knew. Even the magistrate staff wasn't as large as those who served in the Hokage tower, and they had far fewer checkpoints. It wouldn't be that much harder to convince the girl he had taken the tea from to pour the drug into the miso soup they had had for dinner. So, the shinobi had definitely been after Neji. It was something Kaoru could acknowledge, knowing what he did about Kumo's past attempts to get the Byakugan for themselves. It was slightly strange that a missing nin was trying for it this time, but maybe he wanted to get back into the Raikage's good graces. Maybe he wanted to barter his freedom, or maybe he wanted a way to have a power that Kumo didn't have. Either way, it just plain sucked that Neji was the one the ninja had chosen to go after. He had enough shit in his life to deal with, not to mention the seal that Kaoru knew was on his forehead. Once the Kumo nin saw the seal on Neji's forehead, would he realize what it meant, or would he still try to extract Neji's eyes, sealing the Byakugan and killing Neji? Kaoru grit his teeth as he continued through the forest, heading only in the same direction the missing nin had traveled. He couldn't let Neji die. He knew what kind of man the kid could grow up to be. Plus, Neji would eventually end up one of Naruto's friends, after he stopped all his moaning about fate. That trumped any kind of motive the missing nin could have. Naruto pulled the small-ish cloth pack onto his crossed legs and peered into the open top. Kaoru hadn't even packed any ramen. How could he possibly hope to survive on a mission if he didn't pack any ramen? Fortunately, Naruto wasn't actually looking for ramen. He had enough stored in his own pack, plus enough to share just in case Kaoru needed some of his own. But that wasn't so important right now. Naruto's eyes darted to the dark figure at the edge of the room. Sasuke was glowering, which wasn't too different from how he normally looked, although Naruto privately thought Sasuke looked a little angrier like this rather than that stupid, stuck-up look he usually wore. What was really unusual was the fact that Sasuke was glaring at Lee, not at Naruto. Naruto wasn't sure, but he had a feeling it had something to do with Sasuke's red-skinned elbow. Lee, on the other hand, didn't seem the least bit aware of Sasuke's displeasure. "You don't have to do this, Lee-kun," Sakura said with a hint of desperation. "Really?" Lee didn't even pause from his task of performing the one-handed push-ups on the floor of the large room the magistrate had provided. "Yeah, aren't you tired, bushy brows?" demanded Naruto as he shifted Kaoru's small pack in his lap. "But that is the point, dear friend." Lee somehow managed to raise his voice while huffing from his position parallel to the floor. "The lovely Sakura-chan will be able to practice Iryu Jutsu on sore muscles when she cannot on Brock to look at Sasuke, who quickly turned his head away from glaring at Lee in order to avoid his teammate's gaze. Sasuke had refused to allow Sakura to try out the medical jutsu she had been studying. Naruto turned up his nose at the thought of Sasuke being mean to Sakura. Sakura liked Sasuke. She wanted to be acknowledged by him, and Naruto could understand that feeling. That didn't mean Sasuke had to be a bastard about it. Naruto returned his focus to the pack in his lap, scanning the mix of scrolls and the cloth-wrapped block for mixing ink. Naruto hoped Kaoru wouldn't need more help where Kakashi-sensei would see him. Kakashi-sensei was cool, most of the time. But Kaoru's seals were a secret, so Naruto had to keep it a secret. Besides, he hadn't gotten the money to buy him new brushes yet. Naruto suddenly thrust his hand into the pack, scuffled around for a moment as he bit his lip in concentration, and withdrew a short, thin roll of white cloth from the pack. Pushing himself to his feet, Naruto padded across the floor barefooted and dumped the roll of bandages into Sasuke's lap. "Here," Naruto said shortly. Sasuke stared down at the roll in his lap like he wasn't sure what to do with it. Naruto only crossed his arms and stared down at Sasuke. Naruto noticed everything around him get quiet, but he didn't look away from Sasuke until he knew that Sasuke knew what to do. Naruto even considered offering to wind the bandage around Sasuke's arm for him. He knew how difficult that could be from watching Kaoru with his own arms. But Sasuke was just sitting there like a dimwit. Plus the bastard had refused to let Sakura help when she had offered, and that was just mean. Who could not want Sakura-chan to play nurse to him? With his eyes firmly fixed on his lap, Sasuke gingerly picked up the roll of bandages with his uninjured hand. Naruto nodded, satisfied that Sasuke would take it from here. Naruto was allowed to help Kaoru because they were brothers, or close enough to count. Anyway, Sasuke wouldn't be that nice about having help, even from Naruto. Naruto turned and patted his way back to Keiru's pack of stuff. There wasn't any ramen in there, which was kinda hard to believe given the awesomeness that was ramen. But Naruto had definitely seen that scroll that Keiru had been looking at before they had left Konoha. If Naruto took the scroll out of the pack and laid it on the floor, he was just getting it ready for Keiru to look at it, right? And if the scroll just happened to open while waiting for Keiru, well, that wasn't Naruto's fault, right? Naruto snuck his hand into the open mouth of the cloth pack and fished around silently. Then, a crash sounded by the window and a dark body vaulted through the open window. Naruto snatched his hand away from the pack and straightened guiltily. "Keiru," he shouted, hoping his cousin hadn't actually seen him rummaging through his belongings. Keiru didn't look at Naruto, however. He stumbled in his landing, almost falling forward on his face, before he straightened and found Kakashi. Naruto thought Keiru looked a little off, like he had just been sick. "Neji's been taken," Keiru announced without preamble. "What?" Lee pushed himself to his feet from his plank position doing his crazy push-ups. Naruto's eyes widened and saw Kakashi snap his little orange book shut as he surged to his feet. "The Kumo nuke nin from earlier," Keiru said shortly. "He came back." Keiru was panting, which made Naruto a little nervous as he fell on his butt and shoved his feet into his zori. "Poisoned us." Keiru's breathing wasn't getting any easier, and he was sweating. "Got Neji, going west." Keiru jerked a thumb over his shoulder toward the window he had come bursting through. Naruto shoved his toes down, satisfied at the fit, and grabbed his shuriken holster as he jumped to his feet. "How do you know?" Kakashi demanded of Keiru. Naruto thought that was kind of a silly question. Of course Keiru would know what was happening. He had gone up on the roof to make sure Neji was alright because he was cool like that. "Boss is following," Keiru said shortly, "come on." "Yosh!" Lee vaulted forward, his hands balled into fists and his voice showing more intent than enthusiasm. Naruto rushed to Lee's side, standing in front of Keiru ready for action. He noticed that Sasuke had gotten to his feet as well, completely geared for a mission, and Sakura was in the process of shoving her scroll into her pack. "No," Kakashi said immediately as his eyes traveled over all four of the younger genin. "You stay here." Naruto bunched his hands into fists when Keiru didn't say anything to Kakashi. "No way," he shouted. Sasuke wasn't glaring anymore, but he did have a white bandage around his arm. Even Sakura looked pretty darn determined to Naruto. Kakashi was a pretty big bully if he wouldn't even let his own students follow the rules. "We're coming, Kakashi-sensei." Naruto frowned up at Kakashi. Those who leave teammates behind are worse than trash. Naruto kept his eyes on Kakashi-sensei, refusing to look away when he knew he had to convince Kakashi that they had to go after the stupid guy who took Neji. He might have been a bastard, but Neji was a teammate. That was all Naruto really needed to know. "Get into the formation from the road today," Kakashi said. "Keiru and I will lead." Naruto held out his left fist to Lee, who grinned and knocked back with his own fist. Sasuke didn't say a word as he stood next to Sakura, who was tying her hair with an elastic band at the back of her neck. Keiru turned back to the window while Kakashi-sensei followed close behind. Naruto placed both his palms on the windowsill and vaulted out. He landed on a branch next to Keiru and tried to channel enough chakra to his feet to keep from slipping. Suddenly, there was a hand on his arm, holding him steady. "Careful," Keiru said calmly. "I'm alright." Naruto shrugged the hand off. "Let's go." He kind of missed having Keiru helping him, but they didn't have time for that. Naruto had to be strong enough and skilled enough at this to run across branches on his own. He had to be strong enough to protect his teammates. Chapter 21. Keiru stumbled off the thick branch he was on and snapped out his hand to catch himself, hooking his fingers around a smaller branch. He hung there like a monkey for a moment with his arm bearing his weight. He couldn't remember the last time his body had felt this heavy. "Stupid bastard," he grumbled as he pulled himself back up to the branch. "Who puts poison in tea?" Apparently the bastard who had taken Neji's limp body right off the roof was the type to go for poison. Keiru dropped to a lower branch and kept running through the canopy. He was getting pretty good at ignoring the pins and needles that shot through his muscles every time he landed and crouched to take off again. His legs weren't turning to jelly only by sheer force of will. Then, Keiru saw a dark figure moving about on the forest floor. It was heading toward a hill that jutted out from a small stream. The water looked like it had carved out a gorge at the bottom of the rocky hill. More like a cliff. Really? Keiru let himself fall to the forest floor. He felt the muscles in his legs twinge and rolled into a somersault so that he wouldn't collapse to the ground. Then, Keiru sprang up and balled his hands into fists. "Hey!" he shouted. The dark-skinned ninja glanced over his shoulder with Neji's body in his arms. Then he leapt over the stream and disappeared through a crack in the dark rocks. "Ah, come on," whined Keiru. Why did the creepy, pedophile ninja always have to have caves as their hideouts? Was this in some kind of evil megalomaniac handbook Keiru didn't know about? He slipped through the same crack and found the Kumo nuke nin setting Neji on the ground. "What the hell are you doing?" Keiru demanded, hoping his voice didn't crack with the sound of his exhaustion. You shouldn't have followed me. The ninja turned around slowly to face Keiru. You're still weak from my poison. Well, lucky for me I never liked tea that much. Keiru stuck his tongue out childishly. Hanging around Naruto was apparently making Keiru revert to what he had once been instead of the person he was now. Keiru took a step forward to see Neji better, but the Kumo nin drew a tanto and pointed it down at the unconscious boy. Keiru froze and stared at the blade that hovered over Neji's body. He understood the silent threat well enough, and there was no way he could move fast enough to get around the Kumo nin and snatch Neji away or to get the straight blade away from the Kumo nin before he could simply make a downward stroke to cut something vital. His best bet was the fact that he had sent his clone after Kakashi. Kakashi would be more adept in this situation than a drugged Keiru. I thought you wanted the crystal, Keiru said disdainfully. Or are you just interference while your partners attack the village? They left as soon as Konoha showed up. The Kumo nin spat. Cowards didn't want to face a bunch of genin. Keiru almost smiled at that, but now wasn't really the time. Still, he was pretty sure his team was awesome. What are you still sticking around for, then? Keiru couldn't help the wheedling tone that escaped him, bolstered by the idea that Kakashi would be coming soon. You don't know your own history? Demanded the Kumo nin with a bitter laugh. Keiru suddenly felt a little less confident. It was 9 years ago now that the Raikage decided he wanted some of Konoha's strength for himself, continued the missing nin. He sent a shinobi to Konoha under the premise of peace with orders to kidnap a member of the Hyuga clan and bring it back to Kumo. Keiru had hoped the conversation wouldn't go in this direction. Kumo had taken a rather hands-off position toward Konoha for as long as he had been aware of the countries surrounding Hai no Kuni, and that hadn't really been until Jiraiya had taken him on his training trip. He certainly hadn't heard of Neji encountering any disgruntled Kumo nin back when he had been a genin. Bit late for you to be completing that mission, isn't it? Keiru shifted his weight to the balls of his feet carefully. The Kumo nin's face suddenly hardened, and the dark man glared at Keiru with the kind of hate Keiru had seen before only from Sasuke. You wouldn't understand. Keiru curled his fingers one by one and wondered how long he could go on with only his own immune system fighting against the poison already in his body. Whenever Kakashi wanted to show up would be fine with him. You wouldn't understand. The voice pierced Neji's consciousness a moment before he realized he was awake. He didn't recognize the voice. It was too harsh and hurt to be Gai-sensei. But that wasn't right because he was on a mission with Hitaki-sensei and his stupid team. He was my teammate, said the same harsh voice. I was with him from the time we were 9, and he died on that mission. You killed him. Neji peeled his eyes open slowly. A dark figure rose up in front of him, and Neji remembered why he felt so weak. This was the same man he had faced on the road to Harui, a dark-skinned missing nin from Kumo. And how will this help anything? Said another voice. Neji's still blurry eyes strained to focus on the figure beyond the Kumo nin. A shorter figure standing tall despite the dim and damp surroundings of the cavern. Neji saw the redhead's eyes flicker to Neji as he raised one hand in a very non-combatant gesture. He was only a boy. Keiru seemed to realize that Neji was awake right after he finished speaking. Neji quickly shut his eyes, feigning unconsciousness yet again in case the Kumo nin decided to pay him any attention. It rankled his pride to simply lay on the ground, which was getting his back damper by the minute, but it wasn't as if he would be particularly helpful. He couldn't even focus his eyes properly yet. My teammate died because of his family, spat the Kumo nin. And then Konoha sent us a worthless body. The eyes couldn't even be harvested. The muscles in Neji's throat all seized up so that he couldn't swallow back the lump like he wanted to. He knew immediately what the shinobi and Keiru were talking about. It had been nearly 10 years since Kumo's last attempt to steal the Hyuga's dujutsu, but it remained a defining moment in Neji's life. He could remember exactly where he stood when his uncle informed him that his father would not be coming home any longer. So, you're after the Byakugan? Keiru asked, nearly sneering out the words. Neji had barely a moment to consider that would be somewhat worthless because the seal on his forehead would kill him before the Kumo nin could. I couldn't care less about his stupid eyes or what A-sama wants, the nuke nin snapped. I want my vengeance. Vengeance. Keiru's one-word repetition was almost a sigh, like he was disappointed. Neji thought whatever was causing his weakness had affected his hearing as well. You really think that taking a life for a life will solve anything? Demanded Keiru. Why not? The Kumo nin tossed out. His family stole my teammate, my friend. The shinobi's voice was heated and full of hate. Neji opened his eyes once again, assessing his vision and trying to guess how long it would be before he was at fighting strength once again. I know what it's like to lose a brother. The Kumo nin still had his back to Neji, but Keiru's eyes were fixed on the missing nin rather than glancing at Neji at all. I know what it's like to hate the one who's taken someone away from you, Keiru continued in a low voice. But this won't solve anything. Neji saw Keiru take one deliberate step toward the Kumo nin and thought he needed to heal a little bit faster. Running through the forest by leaping from tree branch to tree branch was easier than Naruto thought it would be. It was a matter of judging the distance to the next leap and then taking off as soon as he landed. Really, it wasn't that much harder than running away from people in Konoha who got angry because he had pranked someone or turned a store sign orange. Naruto pressed the edges of his teeth together. This was way more important than thinking about some sass still running up ahead with Kakashi-sensei, leading the way because Kaoru knew where he was going. Kakashi-sensei hadn't really said anything since they left the giant house, which made Naruto think that now was a time to be serious. Plus, there was the way Kaoru had stumbled when he had entered the room. There was something wrong with him. Maybe something hurt him more than it should have on the road. Naruto glanced to his right and saw Lee keeping pace with him quite well. Then, Lee's foot crashed into the branch next to Naruto, and there was a crack like a stick breaking. Naruto kept running. He couldn't stop when his teammate was in trouble, but he glanced over his shoulder to look behind him. Lee had left an indentation in the wood, the exact shape of his foot. Kinda like how Sasuke had when they had just been learning how to walk up trees. Naruto quickly faced forward again before he stumbled over another branch. They seemed to come up faster than Naruto thought they would. Once he was sure of his footing again, he glanced at the tall, skinny boy beside him. "Don't worry," Naruto said quietly, "we'll find him." Lee looked surprised that Naruto had spoken at all, but Naruto didn't mind. This had to be part of being a team. After all, the quiet moments where he trained with Kaoru are the parts where he knew exactly how Sasuke felt, not having any parents to discipline him, and Lee was his teammate even if only for a little while. So Naruto grinned widely and pumped one fist in the air. "And when we catch up to Kaoru and Neji, we'll kick ass just like on the road." Lee smiled a bit at that, so Naruto was satisfied.
"Yes," Lee replied simply. Still grinning, Naruto cast one swift glance over his shoulder before he faced forward again. Sasuke and Sakura were side by side, which didn't bother Naruto as much as he thought it might have, and running just as fast as the rest of them. Sakura looked rather surprised at Naruto, or at his sudden outburst, but Sasuke only wore a smug smirk.
Naruto snickered and supposed Sasuke was practicing for when they beat down the enemy and Sasuke could take his chance at looking cool once again. "Don't come any closer," Daichi shouted as he shifted backwards so that his tanto hovered over the unconscious boy at the back of the cavern wall. The redhead stopped moving, but he didn't change that expression of old sorrow and understanding. Daichi hated that look on his enemy's face. "What do you think will happen?" demanded the young redhead. "If you take Neji's life, his team won't forgive you. His sensei will probably kill you with one punch." The boy's mouth turned up into a wry smile, the kind that almost made Daichi believe what the kid was saying. "And then your loved ones will want vengeance on him, and then Konoha will take vengeance on them," the boy continued. "Hate only brings more hate, like a cycle. That's how the world works, right? Death after death until the whole world is bloody." Daichi hadn't seen eyes like that since the last shinobi war was fresh in everyone's minds. Eyes that had seen people die within an arm's reach when nothing could be done for them. "I've seen that world," said the boy, and Daichi believed him. "It's ugly as hell."
Daichi studied the boy and his eyes that had seen war. The kid hardly looked old enough to remember the Great Shinobi War, but Daichi knew enough about the world to know violence wasn't limited to world wars. Shinobi were, by nature, bloodthirsty and deceptive.
"You can understand my pain," he realized slowly. "Yes." Daichi nodded, then turned around and jerked the Hyuga boy to his feet. The boy's eyes snapped open, though his pupils were non-existent and his eyes looked glazed over. Daichi flipped the tanto in his hand and held it under the boy's chin. "Then your team will know that same pain," declared Daichi.
Immediately, the redhead's eyes hardened, and his hands became fists as his knees bent in more of a fighting stance than a negotiating one.
"Yuru," growled the young man. "You don't want peace? I'll make it simple." Daichi saw it again. It couldn't be the lighting now that was making the young man's eyes turn from blue to blood red. "I'll kill you before you hurt my friend." The redhead flicked his right hand and suddenly held a straight, pointed kunai where his hand had been empty only moments before. His red eyes flickered to a point just above Daichi's head, to his right. For a moment, Daichi worried that the redhead had brought an ally with him or had summoned a clone or animal to sneak around him while the boy kept Daichi occupied with talking. Despite not being able to sense any chakra behind him, Daichi let his eyes follow his enemy's gaze over his shoulder to the height of the cavern. As soon as Daichi had turned his head, he heard the wind brush against a blade and turned back. He raised the tanto that had been threatening the Hyuga boy to bat away the kunai sailing toward him. The boy slumped down as if his legs couldn't hold him, his sudden collapse weighing down one of Daichi's arms as the redhead Konoha nin came charging. Daichi flung the Hyuga boy backward, hoping the kid cracked his skull against the rocks so he would at least be unconscious and easy to handle as soon as he finished this fight. The young man from Konoha surged forward with another kunai in his opposite hand, pointing the weapon fiercely at Daichi's face. Daichi brought his tanto up again and used it to push aside the knife, letting his blade slide along the other boy's hand and forearm as if Daichi was sliding his short blade along a longer sword, like some of the junin in Kumo were issued. The redhead jerked back once the tanto broke skin, but he wasn't fast enough to stop the knife from slicing through the white bandages on his arm. The boy raised his free arm and gripped the collar of Daichi's shirt. Daichi drove his blade closer to the skin of the kid's arm, but the kid seemed to ignore it as his foot kicked out to knock Daichi off balance. He swung the pair of them in a wide circle so that the Konoha nin was standing with his back to the wall of the cavern, directly between Daichi and the Hyuga boy, who was slumped on the stone floor. The white bandages on the redhead seeped with a line of red before splitting open and falling off his arm. Daichi saw the black lines on the boy's arm and thought they were simply circles around his forearm. It was a strange tattoo to have, but Daichi didn't think much of it. But then he realized that the inked lines were far more complicated than mere rings. They were seals. Daichi saw blood dripping from the thin red line his tanto had drawn on the inside of the boy's forearm, right through the black seals that wrapped around his arm. Glancing up, Daichi saw that there were now 3 dark marks, like whiskers, stretching out across either of the kid's cheeks. His eyes nearly glowed a fiery red in the darkness of the cave. "Ya should know better than to tease a fox, Bakayaro," the redhead growled. The boy lifted his right hand, palm up, away from his body. The chakra that slowly gathered in the kid's palm lit up his face with an eerie, ghostly glow. Kakashi threw up a hand in a signal to stop when the red-haired figure beside him abruptly halted his journey through the canopy and dropped to the forest floor. Kakashi really doubted that the genin behind him would recognize the hand signals that Kakashi was giving them. He had sorely skipped out on that part of his team's training, but they would get the idea as Kakashi jumped off his current perch and landed beside the red-headed boy. "Where now?" Kakashi demanded. Keiru cast his eyes around, looking pale, weak, and undoubtedly lost. Kakashi followed the gaze and saw the cold creek spilling across the black rocks at the edge of the tree line. "There's something. Hey, what are we doing?" demanded Naruto as he jumped down to stand just behind Keiru and Kakashi. Kakashi could have done without the questioning, especially when he wasn't quite sure of the answer himself. Keiru's red head turned, the rest of the genin fell into line behind them, and Kakashi heard the beginnings of something creaking and groaning, like an object straining under too much weight. Without saying a word, Kakashi pushed his forehead protector up over his closed eye and stared at the rocks beside the stream. He had the time to see a large crack form in the center of the rocks that jutted up beyond the other side of the stream. The crack split the solid rock face from base nearly to the top like a clay pot breaking. "Whoa!" The figure beside Kakashi leapt forward with Kakashi right behind him. Kakashi already had lightning chakra surrounding his fingers, calling up his natural element without bothering to give it the sharpened shape of Reikiri. "Keiru ni!" Naruto cried just as thunder sounded in the clear sky. The rock face gave way suddenly, blasting outward as if a force had pushed it from the other side. Kakashi saw a dark-skinned figure punch through the rock wall, back first like he had been thrown. Kakashi had only enough time to recognize the man as the Kumo missing nin from the road before he caught a glimpse of blue chakra at the man's stomach. Then, a red head of hair and a solid back blocked his view of the mess in front of him. Annoyed, Kakashi brought up his hand and thrust the raw Raiden chakra in the center of Keiru's back. He wasn't surprised when the figure of Keiru disappeared in a puff of smoke. There had been enough clues. By the time the smoke had cleared from the dispersion of the clone, Kakashi only saw the Kumo missing nin falling backwards as Keiru, the real Keiru, stood in the broken gap of the black rock face with his right arm extended. Even from his position across the stream, Kakashi could see that the young man's arm was bleeding and stripped of the plain bandages he had had on since that afternoon. Keiru stared down at the missing nin's body, still and silent in the cold water, with an expression that made Kakashi think of the war and Minato sensei standing over a battlefield looking down at the bodies he was responsible for. "Keiru ni!" Naruto yelled again. The shout seemed to wake Keiru to his surroundings. He jerked his head up in a startled gesture that made his eyes fall on Naruto immediately. Then Keiru's gaze shifted to Kakashi, and the redhead gave Kakashi a look that Junin couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't suspicious or angry, but there was something hard in Keiru's eyes. "Where's Neji?" called Naruto, cupping his hands around his mouth. "Ah." Keiru blinked again as if he hadn't been expecting the question. "Here." He turned back into the cavern behind him, and Kakashi leapt across the cold creek in 2 quick strides to witness what had happened. By the time he was standing in the broken rock face, taking Keiru's previous place, Keiru was already stooped down on the floor of the cave with Neji in his arms. The boy seemed to be conscious, but he didn't look like his muscles would support any of his weight. Keiru stood and turned to Kakashi, who backed up enough to allow Keiru room to maneuver in the skinny space afforded by the blown-out crevice. "Neji, my friend!" Lee shouted when Keiru appeared with Neji in his arms. Keiru silently passed Neji to Kakashi, who waded across the creek to set the boy on dry ground. Even in the night air, Kakashi could see that Neji's eyes were only half opened. Shaking himself slightly, Keiru knelt beside Kakashi's right side. "He got poisoned," Keiru said in a low voice. "That ninja said he bribed one of the maids to put poison in the tea we drank." Kakashi craned his neck so that he could give Keiru a quick once-over. You seem to be all right, he concluded finally. Keiru scowled at him. I don't like tea. Kakashi shrugged deliberately for the time being and turned his attention back to Neji. He wasn't quite sure what the purpose of the poison had been, but it had certainly cleared out all of the magistrate's so-called protection from the mansion. Kakashi wouldn't be surprised if the two other missing nin from the group they had encountered on the road had taken full advantage of the team's disappearance, if they were, indeed, after the jewel the magistrate was so intent on guarding. Kakashi wasn't that bothered by the thought that the small politician had been robbed. For one thing, it wasn't their mission in the first place, and for another, the missing nin were Kusa's problem, not Konoha's. Keiru-kun, you're bleeding. Kakashi glanced up, seeing his students, including the temporary addition of Lee, who hovered directly over Neji's head, crowding around Kakashi and Keiru. Even Sasuke was standing right behind Naruto, alternating between examining Neji and joining Naruto in peering at Keiru. It was Sakura, however, who brought everyone's attention to Keiru. She was on her knees at Keiru's right side, already digging through the pack slung sideways across her body intently. Let me see, she held out a hand rather commandingly for a 12-year-old who had blushed at the thought of her crush. I'm all right. Keiru stood abruptly before Sakura could touch him. Kakashi's eye caught the way Keiru shifted his shoulder in some attempt to hide his right arm behind his body. But Kakashi could still the blood dripping from the tips of Keiru's fingers down to the darkened ground. Keiru nodded his chin at Neji's still form in front of Kakashi. Neji needs more. Sakura won't know what to do with a victim of poison, interrupted Kakashi. He glanced at Sakura, who was still looking up surprised at Keiru's sudden movement. Unless you've gotten that far in your scrolls already? It took a moment for Sakura to shift her attention from Keiru to her sensei. No, she admitted, looking slightly guilty as if she expected to be farther in her studies when she didn't have a proper tutor. Kakashi nodded and tried to make a mental note to see if any of the Iryu nin at the Konoha hospital had any free time when they got back to Konoha. I'll take care of Neji for now, he announced. Sakura wasted no time in nodding and getting to work. Rising to her feet, Sakura grabbed Keiru's left hand and led him over to a large dark rock jutting out from the creek bank. Keiru didn't look at Kakashi as he followed after Sakura like an obedient puppy, but he didn't protest any further, either. Kakashi suspected Keiru knew that Sakura wouldn't be able to help Neji as much as Kakashi would, even with his limited training. I'll help you, Sakura-chan, Naruto declared, following behind his cousin as his hand dipped into his shuriken pouch. I don't have any bandages. Naruto nearly flailed his arms into pinwheels in his panic, but then a calm hand thrust a fresh roll of white cloth in Sakura's face. Here, Sasuke's voice was the same nondescript, calm tone that Kakashi had come to expect to him. But Kakashi could still see the way the boy held his muscles slightly tenser than the situation called for with the enemy disposed of already. Kakashi tore his gaze from the way his three students crowded around the older redhead and returned his attention to Neji. Will he be alright? Lee asked in a quieter voice than Kakashi had ever heard him use. Kakashi made a precise incision on Neji's forearm and smeared the boy's blood on a thin strip of specially tinted paper from his first aid kit. After watching it change color, Kakashi gave Guy's student an encouraging smile. He should be fine, Kakashi announced. It seems the poison was merely intended to knock Neji unconscious. It's nothing more serious than very strong sleeping pills. Lee's shoulders slumped in relief as Neji's head lolled, as if he decided the battle with unconsciousness wasn't worth fighting anymore. Kakashi administered a basic antidote from his kit, meant to speed the recovery process, and then looked over at his team. Sakura was just finishing wrapping fresh bandages around Keiru's right arm. With Keiru extending his arm for Sakura's ease of work, Kakashi could see the shadow of ink just on the inside of Keiru's elbow. Kakashi had seen the seals that decorated Keiru's and never taken the time to study them. He left Neji in Lee's hyper-observant care and strode to where Sakura was turned to the pile of used gauze by her side. Let me take those. Kakashi scooped the bloody gauze from off the ground before Sakura could touch it. Used bandages should be disposed of properly, right, Sakura? He smiled at her for reassurance, which she seemed to take in stride, even straightening up proudly. How's Neji? Interjected Keiru. I've given him a basic antidote, and the poison is already working its way out of his system, Kakashi replied without thinking. It was only after he finished that Kakashi realized he had sounded more like a subordinate reporting than a teacher being reassuring. Abruptly, he spun on his heel. I'll be right back, he announced. Try to get Neji on his feet so he can get back to town. Sakura hastened to Neji's side, still taking her duties as the only thing resembling a med nin seriously. Sasuke followed very reluctantly, and Naruto only moved when Keiru pushed himself to his feet, bracing his palms on his knees. Kakashi stood over the body of the Kumo missing nin and bent down to begin the process of destroying the body. It technically wasn't his job. He could just leave the body for the man's teammates or a Kumo hunter nin to find. But Kakashi had been in Anbu too long to leave any messes behind him. Then, Kakashi noted the wound on the man's stomach. It was fatal. That was obvious from the sheer amount of mess the wound had left behind. But more than that, it was familiar. The man's torso had been carved out like someone had taken a spoon to his center. But the skin all around the wound was puckered and sliced into a spiral. Swirled grooves all leading into the point where Kakashi could practically see through the hole in the man's body. Kakashi suddenly bent down and threw the body onto dry ground. In a fit of paranoia, he didn't even take the man's head before lighting the body on fire. "I could have done that," said Kaoru from just behind Kakashi's shoulder. Kakashi had to command his heart to be still before he glanced behind him. "Oh, have you done this before?" Kakashi asked, his voice a little sharper than he wanted it to be. Kaoru's answer was to look away from Kakashi's one-eyed gaze and study the genin crowding around Neji, who was apparently awake enough to protest being manhandled by both Lee and Naruto. "I haven't forgotten you zapped me in the back," Kaoru pouted, his lips pursing in a manner very similar to what Kakashi had seen before on Naruto. "That was a clone," Kakashi said, his voice deadened. "How did you know it was a clone?" demanded the redhead. "It called you, boss." Kakashi turned, done with the conversation that had no real point anyway, and approached his kids. They needed to get back to the village so that Neji could properly sleep off the rest of the poison, and then they would leave as soon as it was light. Considering recent events, Kakashi was suddenly very eager to be back in Konoha. Neji woke after his teammates were already awake and ready to face the day. Ignoring the stiffness around his shoulders that almost suggested he had slept in a strange position, Neji got ready hurriedly while Lee hovered nearby, ready to assist his teammate in any way. Neji tried not to think of how he had to place one hand on Lee's shoulder when he had stumbled out the doorway of the room. The other genin team paid a little less attention to him. Sakura eyed him speculatively but seemed content to leave him alone once she had determined that he was up to full health again. Uchiha said nothing, only continued with his packing. Naruto was nowhere in sight, nor was the only Junin. "Where is Hitaki-sensei?" Neji asked the room. "Trying to get out of pain for the night's stay," answered a voice from the corner. Neji turned to where Kaoru was carefully unwrapping the strip of bandages that covered his left arm. Neji was almost surprised that Sakura was letting him before he realized that it had been Kaoru's right arm that was injured. The only thing under the bandages in Kaoru's hand currently was a black design that stretched from his left wrist all the way up to his elbow. Neji knew that parts of the previous night were hazy, but he still remembered enough. He nodded curtly to Lee to dismiss him and strode over to the older boy. Kaoru looked up when Neji stood in front of him, but his only reaction was a brief nod before he returned his attention to his arm. When Kumo demanded recompense for their ambassador, "My father's body was sent to Kumo so that they wouldn't get the Baigaken," Neji blurted. A part of him was secretly glad of Kaoru's wide eyes and shocked look. At least the older genin knew what it meant for Neji to share something so personal. "Why are you telling me?" Kaoru asked in a low voice. Neji resisted glancing over his shoulder to see what the rest of the room's occupants were doing. He could sense their chakra well enough to know none of them would be able to overhear unless they had a bloodline that included super hearing. "Who did you lose?" Neji demanded. When Kaoru's face dropped and Neji suspected he would refuse to answer, he pressed harder. "You said you knew how he felt. You lost someone." Kaoru glanced up at Neji with a look that almost suggested he wanted to roll his eyes. "I'm beginning to think you're not an ass," he said, exasperated. "You just have no idea how to talk to someone." "Who did you lose?" Neji repeated. Kaoru's eyes fell to his arm as he continued stripping the bandages away. "My mother, my father," Kaoru said without looking up. "My godfather, Ojiji, Oba-chan. My first love, my sensei, and my best friend." Neji almost believed that Kaoru was exaggerating, but then Kaoru met Neji's eyes. Kaoru's eyes were deep blue and haunted. They belonged to someone who had seen someone precious die in front of their eyes. It was a personal hurt, not at the world but just sorrowful and alone. Neji tried not to blink and lose the eye contact, but he felt awkward saying nothing when Kaoru had obviously let him see something so private. "You keep telling me I don't know anything about you, but you don't know about me, either," Kaoru declared. "Then tell me," Neji returned. "Why do you have those seals?" Kaoru let his eyes fall back to his arm. "How good are your eyes?" he asked as he peeled off the last of the bandages and let them fall away. Neji obligingly activated his jujutsu and stared at the black symbols on Kaoru's arm. He saw a yellow shade of chakra flowing through Kaoru's arm like blood through veins. But overlaid on top of that was another shade running in the very same patterns as the seals traced out on Kaoru's arm. "Those seals have chakra in them," Neji murmured, taking in the way the chakra moved sluggishly. Then, Neji's eyes saw the same ugly, red chakra in the seals seeping into Kaoru's regular chakra coils. The coils around the seals were raw, as if inflamed, as a result. Neji traced the slow leakage of red chakra through Kaoru's tenketsu like he was watching tainted water flowing. Once Neji reached Kaoru's torso, he saw thin tendrils of the red chakra clinging to Kaoru's major organs like capillaries. Neji looked up into Kaoru's face, quickly deactivating his bloodline so that he could read the older boy's expression. "It's killing you." Neji remembered just in time to keep his voice low. Keiru did not look surprised. "It's been killing me since I first got it." He picked up the roll of bandages lying loosely on the floor and pressed the end of it into the palm of his hand. His eyes were on his work as he started winding the cloth around his hand, moving to his wrist. "Can't even fight right with these. Damn luck I could do that jutsu." "That jutsu?" repeated Neji. Keiru's eyes, sharp again like lightning in a blue sky instead of a pool, snapped up to Neji. "Did you see the technique I used on the Kumo nen?" he asked. Neji frowned. He had been half asleep and still drugged when Keiru had fought with the man who had kidnapped him. Irankla had been so helpless, but the fact remained that Keiru's back had been facing Neji when he had made his final strike against the enemy. The only thing Neji remembered was the vague shape of the jutsu and the way the chakra moved. "It looked like a storm in the palm of your hand," Neji said finally. "Don't tell anyone about that jutsu, Neji," Keiru ordered as if he fully expected to be obeyed. "The only reason I could do it was because my chains had already broke." "Chains?" Neji frowned down at the markings that were slowly disappearing under the white bandage. "What did you think these were for?" Keiru shot Neji a wry smile as he tapped the back of one finger against the inked skin that was still visible. "I told you, you're not the expert on curses, Neji, or on cursed seals." "What is it?" Neji frowned curiously down at the seals. It was clear that the seals were tied into Keiru's chakra coils. But Neji had never heard of a seal that contained a completely separate source of chakra tied in with a ninja's own chakra system. And the chakra tied to the seals themselves looked more like poison than anything that would give Keiru extra strength. Keiru scoffed softly and kept winding the cloth around his chains. "I was practically born with a power I didn't ask for," Keiru said. "And then, when it broke, I was only good for dying. So, I decided it would be on my terms. I would die so that someone precious to me could live. 'Cause I don't give a damn about fate, Neji, but that's something worth dying for." Keiru tied off his bandage just above his elbow and pinned Neji with a sharp look again that made Neji wonder just how close Keiru was to death. Throughout his life, Neji had never actually felt the effects of the caged bird seal. The threat always loomed over his head, but none of the main family members had ever activated the seal on his forehead. He only had the memory of the pain his father had endured that one time. But Keiru spoke of death and dying as if it was a given reality. As if he were far more familiar with the concept that his seals would kill him than Neji could ever be. "Hey, Keiru ni!" Naruto burst into the room with Kakashi following close behind. Keiru grinned widely at the boy as if the grim conversation he had been involved in moments before hadn't even happened. Neji watched Keiru stand and stride to greet Naruto and wondered how someone who had been given a fate to die could smile so large. "You still practicing, Gaki?" Keiru demanded. The pace going back to Konoha was a little bit more intense than the journey to Hikui had been. Kakashi had already implied that the team would be taking to running across tree branches as soon as they got far enough away from the town. Keiru half suspected that was only because Kakashi was eager to get away from the magistrate, who had spent the morning demanding the Konoha team pay for their night sleeping in his house after his jewel had been stolen in their absence. But for now, the road still served as their mode of transportation. Walking beside Keiru, Naruto held up his right hand and demonstrated. "It's not that easy, Keiru ni," he pouted. There had been no time to train after the debacle with the Kumo nuke nen and Kakashi's hurry to get out of town. Keiru had to content himself with making Naruto continue the exercise he had been working on during the journey out. Suddenly, Keiru got an idea. "Hold on." Keiru stopped and turned to face Naruto, grabbing the upraised hand. Naruto paused and frowned curiously as Keiru dipped his hand into his bag and withdrew his brush. He unwrapped his ink block just enough to swipe the bristles across the damp surface and took Naruto's hand in his own. Remembering the task of concentrating on a water ball, a balloon, a single leaf that represented the basis of his power, Keiru curved the tip of the brush across Naruto's palm in a familiar spiral. "Concentrate on that," ordered the redhead. He stuffed the ink block and brush back into the pack on his back, ignoring the way Naruto stared at his actions instead of the new symbol on his hand. "Yosh," Naruto muttered finally and fixed his eyes on the swirl on his hand. "Just don't trip, 'cause you're not looking where you're going." Keiru smiled as he kept walking down the road. Yeah, Naruto would get it. However he might mess up everything else, Keiru had faith in Naruto. Soon, Naruto was spending so much concentration on his hand that he ceased paying attention to how fast he was walking. His eyes remained fixed on the symbol on his palm as he managed to outpace even Kakashi's position at the head of the troop on the road. Keiru glanced up ahead to see Sakura and Sasuke walking just behind Naruto. Sasuke was eyeing his teammate and sometime rival as if he half expected Naruto to stumble over his own 2 feet. A part of Keiru's mind wondered if Sasuke would actually dart forward to catch Naruto if that happened. Maybe not yet. When his eyes relaxed, Keiru saw Neji, who was walking just behind Lee and Kakashi. He was staring at Keiru over his shoulder with that super serious gaze that Neji had probably perfected by the time he was 5. "Feeling alright, Neji?" Keiru asked, fully anticipating a short but positive response because when would the great Hyuga Neji ever admit to weakness? "You are marked," Neji said instead. The strange comment surprised Keiru so much that he stopped walking and fixed his attention fully on Neji. Neji stopped as well, turning fully to face Keiru. "You have been branded as much as I, and yet you." Keiru waited, but Neji only frowned up at the older genin, seemingly unable to finish his sentence. Finally, Neji waved one palm behind him. "You're like Lee," he said in disgust. Keiru immediately grinned. He could think of much worse people to be compared to than the proud student of Konoha's green beast. Besides, if Neji recognized Lee's positive attitude already, then there was hope for Neji's own attitude in the face of circumstances that were just as impossible as Lee's inability to use chakra. Keiru realized then what he thought Neji meant. Even if Neji didn't know how much the seals and the Kyuubi's chakra was still affecting Keiru's body, he recognized at least that Keiru was dealing with a limitation. Keiru glanced ahead at Lee, wondering how best to answer. His gaze swept across Kakashi's straight back and took in Naruto, Sasuke, and Sakura. He smiled. "It won't always be like this," Keiru said as he looked back at Neji. "Those who lead the village determine which way the future will go. You were born in the branch family, but the head's still your uncle. Soon, it'll be your turn to lead, won't it?" Keiru knew Neji would become a leader of men, of his own family, by his sheer strength and skill. Keiru had seen Neji lead because he had been one of the only Hyuga left who could lead. He couldn't imagine what Neji could do if given the respect of the entire next generation of Hyuga, branch and main family alike. Neji followed Keiru's reminiscent gaze down the road ahead of them both and scoffed softly. "Inari help us if those are our leaders," he muttered. Keiru blinked at Neji and thought of curses from gods and bad luck and then determination and whirlpools and strange abilities to become stronger just because people were relying on you. Then, Keiru threw back his head and laughed loud and hard, like he hadn't laughed for months. By the time Keiru ran out of breath and started walking again, Kakashi was looking over his shoulder to see what the commotion was about and Neji wore an expression of extreme discomfort. "You never know," Keiru said as he strode past Neji. "Inari just might." Sarutobi watched Naruto bound out of the office once he had been handed his mission voucher as a paycheck. The boy didn't even pause as he called over his shoulder to his cousin that he'd meet Keiru at home. Keiru shook his head, but he shot the Hokage a cautious glance before he seemed to consider himself dismissed as well. The other genin left with short, respectful bows. Lee walking beside Neji after Velut made to the hospital for a final checkup. Only the team leader remained in the office after the combined team's report. But Sarutobi felt he knew why Kakashi hadn't dismissed himself along with his genin. "Any further discoveries, Kakashi?" Sarutobi tapped dry tobacco leaves down into the bowl of his pipe and reached for a match. "Keiru seems unusually protective of his wounds," Kakashi began in a professional tone. "He usually has Naruto bandage his wounds and no one else, but I managed to procure a sample." Kakashi lifted a gauze pad from his pocket. The cotton was stained with rusty blood, mostly dry. Sarutobi nodded at a blank paper on the edge of his desk. He would deliver the blood sample to the hospital himself later in the day. He knew the testing system at the hospital was not as advanced as a couple of the other hidden villages had. It certainly hadn't been up to Tsunade's standards, but she hadn't had time to work on it before she left. Still, what they had currently should be enough for what Sarutobi wanted to know. "Naruto also knows the meaning of the term, jinchuriki, now," Kakashi said as he handed over the bloody gauze. Keiru told him. Sarutobi exhaled, a stream of smoke hissing out from between his lips. "I did inform Keiru that Naruto was the host for the Kyuubi," Sarutobi sighed. "A mistake on my part, I admit now." At the time, all evidence pointed to Keiru's story being true. His looks, his knowledge of a hidden village that no longer existed, his emotions had all validated his claim of being a former resident of the Uzushiobakure and a relative of Uzumaki Kushina. Now, with every new factoid Kakashi brought to his attention, Sarutobi was beginning to regret his faith in this strange boy and his hope that Naruto had finally caught a break. "He might have already known about the Kyuubi," Kakashi said abruptly. "Keiru, I mean." Sarutobi nodded silently and slowly. When he lifted his gaze to the man in front of his desk again, he found Kakashi's gaze fixed firmly on the portrait of the Yondaime Hokage that was mounted high on the office wall. "He laughs like sensei," Kakashi murmured. "When he really let go, threw his head back, Keiru laughs like that." Sarutobi had nothing to say to that. How could he refute the ghosts of Kakashi's memories and habits that shouldn't exist in anyone Keiru's age? There was no explanation for the behavior that made any sort of sense. "I will get the blood tested as quickly as possible," Sarutobi offered, but that was all he could do. Kakashi snapped his head away from his old teacher's serious gaze and nodded formally at the Hokage. He turned on his heel and started to exit the office. Just as Sarutobi had leaned back and taken a deep breath of the pipe smoke in an effort to relax, Kakashi paused and glanced over his shoulder. "One more thing," he began. "The jutsu Keiru used to take out the nuke nin. I didn't see the full jutsu, but I saw the body afterward, the effect Keiru had on the nuke nen. The wound looked like it had been inflicted by Rasengan. Chapter 22. Kusunoki Akira was almost ready to close up his shop for the night and go home to his wife. There might even be the chance for some sake heated up to sip on. But then the bell above his door jingled softly, signaling the entrance of one last customer. "Hey, Akira-san," the large man with white, spiky hair called out. "Are you ready for my latest creation?" Akira only shook his head and ducked behind the counter to retrieve a tightly rolled scroll with no markings on it. "You have a message, Jiraiya-san," he said as he held out the scroll to the large man. Already? Jiraiya looked surprised, but he stepped forward to accept the scroll. "I didn't expect the old man to send something. A team from Konoha was in here yesterday," Akira answered as Jiraiya slid the scroll open and peered at the contents. "I recognized Sharingan no Kakashi. He had a whole bunch of kids with him, though." Akira had been a little surprised at the kids. Usually messages passed through his store by way of brightly colored toads that had a tendency to ask Akira for treats. They especially liked candy. Akira glanced up to his guest to ask why the darned pollywags had been absent this time, but then he noticed Jiraiya's stone-faced look as he studied the open scroll. "Bad news, Jiraiya-san?" he asked. Jiraiya looked up, a wry smile creasing the corners of his mouth. "Apparently I'm going home early." Naruto jogged up to the red bridge that crossed over the small stream. It was kind of a pointless bridge, since the ninja of the village could leap across the stream with no trouble, but Naruto supposed they had to put something up for the academy students who weren't at his level yet. Oh, and the civilians. And maybe the older people in the village who couldn't get around too easily. Oh, forget it. As Naruto approached the bridge, he saw Sakura crossing the bridge, heading in the direction Naruto had just come from. "Sakura-chan?" Naruto blinked in surprise. He hadn't been searching for his teammates at all. "Where are you going?" She looked like she was ready for a mission, with her long hair pulled back into a tie at the base of her neck. Her shuriken holster was tied to her leg, but it was jammed with short scrolls instead of weapons. "Reiko-sensei at the hospital said I could follow her around for the day if I didn't get in her way," Sakura said with a pleased grin. "See you later." Dazed, Naruto raised a hand and waved back at Sakura's back as she threw a brief wave over her shoulder while jogging down the packed dirt road. At least she had said goodbye to him. That was more than Sakura ever used to do when they had bumped into each other. "What did you come out here for, Dobi?" drawled a voice from behind Naruto. Naruto spun around and glared at Sasuke. Sasuke, for his part, looked remarkably unbothered by the hatred, keeping his pose of slouching up against the large tree on the other side of the bridge while he kept his hands in his pockets. "We have a free day," Sasuke told Naruto as if Naruto couldn't figure it out himself. "I know that, Teme," growled Naruto. "They always had a free day right after they got back from a mission. I was looking for Keiru. He wasn't in the apartment this morning." That had been weird. Naruto had wanted to give Keiru the new set of feud he had bought right away that morning, but Keiru hadn't been in the apartment when Naruto woke up. So far, Keiru wasn't at the Hokage Tower, the memorial field, Ichiraku Ramen, or the bridge where Team 7 so frequently met. "Why would he be here?" Sasuke scoffed. "Shut up." Naruto clenched his fists and scowled. "Why are you here?" He at least had an excuse, thinking that Keiru might have, though he was supposed to meet with Team 7 that morning. Keiru was still a little new to Konoha, so maybe he didn't know the rules yet. "Oi!" Naruto glanced over his shoulder at the familiar voice and saw Keiru making his lazy way up toward the red bridge. "Don't you guys have anything better to do than team meetings?" Keiru smirked at the two boys. "Keiru ni." Naruto bounded up to stand in front of Keiru. "Where'd you go?" "You were out of groceries this morning." Keiru jerked one thumb over his shoulder toward the town of Konoha. "I couldn't even make breakfast, so I had to go shopping." Naruto didn't see why that was such a big deal. He had forgotten to eat in his hurry to find Keiru. But Keiru could have just had some of his instant ramen that morning. "What are you guys doing?" Keiru asked as his gaze flickered over to Sasuke. "Where's Sakura-chan?" "She said she was gonna follow some sensei at the hospital," Naruto blurted, glad he had an answer to Keiru's question. "Really?" Keiru looked surprised for a moment, but then he smiled. "Good for her." Naruto smiled along with Keiru and laced his fingers together behind his head. It was like his whole team was getting stronger now. "Hey, since she's getting a full day of learning, how about we train, too?" "Yeah." Naruto pumped his fist in the air enthusiastically. PFF'd. Sasuke made a noise through his lips behind Naruto. "What are you gonna do? Wait until he picks you up and headbutt him." "Hey." Naruto's expression changed from joyful to annoyed in a heartbeat as he spun around to face Sasuke. That headbutt thing had only happened once, and that was because Naruto was practicing his improvisation. But then Keiru ni chuckled and laid one hand on the top of Naruto's head as he crossed the bridge and headed for the green training area. "Well, let's go then," Keiru called. Naruto stuck out his tongue at Keiru's back, but he followed anyway. If training along with Sasuke was the pride he had to pay for training with his brother, then Naruto wouldn't complain too much. Besides, when it came to having someone strong to train with, someone that would make him stronger just by having a high goal to aim for, Sasuke wasn't that bad. "Hey, old man," Jiraiya called from the window of the Hokage tower. "What's the rush? I was coming back in a week anyway." His position, crouched on a windowsill in the tall red building, was more nostalgic than anything. After all, Sarutobi-sensei had become Hokage even before his team had been awarded the label of the Dentatsu no Sannin. Jiraiya had popped through this window many times before, back when the village had been his main home instead of just a stopping point between his information-gathering missions. Sarutobi-sensei rose from his wooden chair slowly and reached for something on his desk. Every time Jiraiya returned to Konoha, the man seemed to have aged by at least another 5 years. He didn't quite like seeing his sensei so hindered by the regular aches and pains of humanity. Jiraiya dropped from the windowsill and met Sarutobi at the corner of his desk so the man didn't have to walk all the way to the window. "What can you tell me about this seal?" Sarutobi asked as he handed Jiraiya a square piece of paper. Jiraiya frowned down at the example of fuinjutsu and then lifted his brows, impressed despite himself. The seal was large enough to need a much bigger canvas than the small square paper that he held. A series of rings dotted either side of the paper one way, like the east and west points of a compass. Going in the opposite direction were lines that would have traced all the chakra points on a torso, as if the seal was meant to overlay someone's chest. "This is complicated," Jiraiya admitted. "It involves tying down someone's chakra, making it impossible for them to channel chakra properly. Might even cut them off from any attempt to use ninjutsu." Jiraiya couldn't imagine the seal being used in a situation where the victim wasn't either dying or deliberately being placed in a coma. He frowned up at his old sensei. "Do you have a prisoner I don't know about?" Jiraiya hoped the answer was a negative. The only nuke nin Konoha had that warranted this level of security were all the ones Jiraiya would not want to meet. Sarutobi sank back in his chair and clamped his wooden pipe between his teeth. "That seal was redrawn father memory after he saw it on a patient we had here about 3 months ago," answered the Hokage. The patient claimed to be related to the Uzumaki clan. "That clan died out," Jiraiya retorted immediately, instinctively. The village was utterly destroyed in the war. Jiraiya didn't want to remember the refugees Konoha had taken in because of Uzushiyogakure's destruction. People that looked just as ragged and hopeless as those damn kids had in aim. "Yes," Sarutobi murmured. "A Chunin scouting team found the young man in the forest, badly beaten. Takahashi-sensei informed me of his seals when he was brought to Konoha. Upon waking, he claimed his name was Uzumaki Keiru and he was looking for a family member, Uzumaki Kushina." "Kushina?"